Chapter 992. This doesn't seem like Tide Rush. It's too purposeful. It seems like there really is something attracting them, triggering their greed and restless emotions. Though Meng Chong had a physical body, the Blood Flame Order was a professional among professionals when it came to sensing and utilizing the extreme emotions of living creatures. Their words held great authority. Of course, in Meng Chong's mind, the greatest authority was right by his side. His gaze naturally turned to Luonan. Zhang Yingying saw this and suddenly came to a realization. Luonan, what the hell are you doing now? Luonan spread his hands. He didn't say anything, but he suddenly tilted his head. Do you guys hear something? Don't change the subject. Do you have ears? Oh, I was wrong. It's an oscillating psychic wave. It seems to be. A cry for help? A cry for help? Who? Is there a ship in distress nearby? Zhang Yingying really did communicate with the cockpit as she spoke. She turned around and spread her hands at Luonan. I already said it's a psychic wave. It's not an electric wave. How far can a psychic wave travel? Forget it. Pretend I didn't say anything. Zhang Yingying had no way of refuting a master of mental senses who had redefined the structure of the mental domain. She didn't want to pester endlessly, so she could only discuss the matter as it stood. Which location? There are only so many people in the inner world. Maybe they know each other. I'll help them if I can. Luonan pointed at the deck. A ship? An ocean yacht murder case? The guys in the group never expected something like this to happen. Their excitement rose to their heads, and their imaginations couldn't be shut. Zhang Yingying couldn't help but roll her eyes. Hey, in order to go out to sea with you on Luo, we set out in light gear. There are only a few people on the yacht. Other than the front deck, they're in the cockpit. When we get back, we even have to fish and cook dinner on the spot. Murder. Murder my ass. Bamboo pole was more reliable. You mean under the ship? In the ocean? Cat Eyes, who had been silent all this time, suddenly said, maybe they're already in the belly of a big fish. Needless to say, it wasn't impossible. Not to mention the undulating sea surface that had a height difference of over 10 meters, even if the surrounding sea was densely packed with marine life, only 10 to 20% of them were mutants. It would be a fatal danger if one were to fall inside. Zhang Yingying knew her own limits. Just by looking at the situation, she knew that if she fell down, she could only scream for help. She saw that Luonan's mind was a bit erratic. Perhaps he was still trying to capture the exact source of the psychic wave, but she was not surprised. She turned her gaze to look at Meng Chong. Lao Meng? Zhang Yingying's deliberate closeness wasn't the main point. The main point was her intimate relationship with Luonan. So, Meng Chong bowed slightly and was very polite. The qi dynamic in the sea is chaotic, and extreme emotions are mixed together. I can't control the details better than you, so I really didn't sense it. However, if there really was such a spiritual wave, being able to keep up with the high-speed cruise ship and transmit it in such a noisy environment, it must have a certain level of strength and should also have an outstanding disguise method. If that's the case, I could have just taken advantage of the chaos to escape. Yet, I ended up in a situation where I had to ask for help. It's either that I ran out of energy and couldn't maintain my disguise for a long time, or that I've been locked onto by someone stronger. If it's the former, the other party should do their best to approach the yacht and attract our attention. If it's the latter, I can basically confirm that this is a conflict on the B-rank level. There are a few B-rank mutants in the surroundings, but there aren't many. There are even fewer areas of conflict. Meng Chong's way of thinking was quite rigorous, but there were still a few B-rank mutants. Zhang Yingying rolled her eyes again. But in this large ecosystem of the sea, Meng Chong's description was completely correct. This was especially true around T-City, the most important hunting ground for marine mutants in the world. So, was there a conclusion? Zhang Yingying looked at Luonan once more, but Luonan still didn't speak. Not only that, but his gaze was oddly cast towards the sky. It really was confusing. On the contrary, Meng Chong hesitated for a few seconds before his gaze turned to a certain location on the starboard side of the front deck. Zhang Yingying was very quick-witted. Her gaze and the camera followed at the same time. She showed great mercy and gave her friends in Xia City a live broadcast. The timing was just right. Only a second or two passed before a dark green shadow suddenly appeared on the side of the ship. It leaped out at a speed far exceeding that of most marine life forms. Under the dusky sky and sea, its body seemed to have been smeared with a layer of fluorescent substance. It was extremely conspicuous. However, everyone could more or less see that this was a natural radiation phenomenon when its spiritual power was fully unleashed. It clearly couldn't hide any longer and fled with all its might. What was that? The fluorescent light reflected a silhouette. It was malevolent and ugly to the point of stupefaction. It was like an extremely large spider covered in muscles. It stuck close to the surface of the sea and floated past with a whooshing sound. A water spider? Speaking of which, I saw a bull's head. Was it an illusion? With the current transmission speed of the satellite network, a relatively smooth image could still be seen. But once it entered the high-speed range, it would be so blurry that even one's own mother wouldn't be able to recognize it. Before the group of people in the group could struggle out of the low-quality image, a long gray shadow leaped out. The surging water around its body was like a high-speed water blade. It hummed and hissed, beheading countless shoals of fish in its path. A few muffled sounds of metal rubbing against metal could be heard in the middle. "Ah, my boat!" Zhang Yingying's cry of surprise was only a foil. Most people's attention was still on the chase. The muscular spider in front looked huge, but its lightness was incredible. It moved on the undulating waves of the sea as if it was walking on flat ground. It was extremely agile, as if it could fly at any time. As for the one chasing behind, it looked like a conger eel or a sea snake. It looked fierce and violent, like a long spear or a giant axe. With a single movement it could cut apart all living things in its path. It had an extremely strong explosive power, and was definitely faster than the former. It was just that its agility was slightly inferior, which was why the muscular spider in front of it had repeatedly escaped. Perhaps that was why the muscular spider did not dare to go too far. It used the yacht as cover and circled on the surface of the sea. It really is a B-class. Zhang Yingying was a little jealous. Generally speaking, the B-class spiritual side was easier to distinguish. It was based on whether one's consciousness could penetrate into the abyss and interfere with it. The standard for physical side was a little more vague, but turning nothingness into reality was definitely a hard bar. To be able to borrow power from relatively insubstantial objects such as seawater and the atmosphere, even with the addition of the racial ability, it was not too far off. After watching for a long time, everyone had absorbed enough images and began to distinguish some things. F***CK, a battleship slicing blade. Which one? The one behind. Obviously. Bamboo Pole was still at the level of an intelligence expert. In a few seconds, he had sent the information and relevant images to the group. Be careful, this kind of mutated blade eel is also a stubborn child. Its entire body is harder than gold and iron. Cutting the hull of a ship at high speed and causing a shipwreck is a common occurrence. Moreover, it is used to non-hunting killing, so there is no reason for it to slash people. If you could send this 10 seconds earlier, I would be very grateful to you. Zhang Yingying blew hard on her forehead to dispel the annoyance in her heart. The problem was that the hair in front of her forehead was already wet and could not be blown up. It was even more annoying to have it lying on her forehead. The starboard hull is damaged. There is no leakage right now, but it will be hard to say in a few minutes. Also, what is that deformed thing in front of us? Right now, everyone knew that it was not a spider and that the bull head was not an illusion. That fellow really did grow half a bull's body. Its muscles were knotted, and its head had a short horn, a long face, a thick nose, and a large mouth. It was indeed an enormous bullhead. However, the area where the bull body and the spider body were connected swelled and deformed. It began to rapidly transform into the image of a spider, and the dark green fluorescence it emitted came from this area. 8 hairy claws extended out from the area where the body was connected. The tips of the claws were faintly discernible, looking extremely tough and sharp. Zhang Yingying frowned as she evaluated. This body structure is a bit like a human-faced arachnid. If that thing had a body, could it be called a cow-faced arachnid? This is a bull demon, the traditional demon form of Ban City. The one who responded to her was actually Luo Nan, who was destined to have no fate with Erudite. Zhang Yingying was truly shocked. How did you know? You've seen it in Ban City? You could say that. Luo Nan had indeed seen a portion of the roughly processed bull demon skeleton before. The processing factory of the Great Zhe Order was most proficient in processing this kind of mutant material. The perfect skeleton that Luo Nan's main body needed to display its greatest combat strength was made from this material. You really are different now that you have experience. It was hard to tell whether Zhang Yingying's words were praise or sarcasm. Oh right, didn't you just say that someone was crying for help? How come a bull demon popped out in the end? Where's the person? Luo Nan raised his chin and once again stamped the scene of the chase, which had already circled to the rear half of the yacht. Actually, there was no need for confirmation. Many people, including Zhang Yingying, had already reacted. You're joking, right? That muscular spider, bull demon? Yeah, it's the one crying for help. It's been crying for help all this time. It seems to have recognized Her Majesty Empress Wu. You guys sense it carefully. You're getting more and more bizarre the more you talk. Zhang Yingying looked at Meng Chong. Meng Chong smiled wryly and shook his head. The mental domain is too chaotic. I'm not good at this. Luo Nan felt that the situation was very clear. This bull demon is very smart. It has some ability to communicate with people. It discovered that it was being chased and that its chances of escaping were slim. It simply fired psychic waves to tangle with us. Let's hope that Her Majesty Empress Wu can save its life. The chain of logic is quite complete. Zhang Yingying could only give this evaluation. It must be said that the level of intelligence of high-level mutants had always been the focus of research in the wilderness. Ever since the era of mutants, there were hundreds of cases of mutants and humans realizing the communication of consciousness. Be it true or false, these cases occurred every year. Zhang Yingying would not easily refute or deny a person of authority like Luo Nan. She just wanted to figure things out. You're saying that it went looking for the boss and then you monitored it? Something like that. The boss didn't respond to it? Not at the moment. It should be. Indeed. Zhang Yingying looked at the exhausted appearance of the bull demon. If Her Majesty Empress Wu allowed it, then it wouldn't be like this. The boss didn't respond to it. Could it be that he thinks it's too ugly? He probably doesn't want to get involved in trouble. Zhang Yingying pursed her lips. I feel that letting it go would be a big problem. If we let that battleship slicing blade make a few more rounds, then it'll be our turn to send a distress signal. How far away is T-City? It's the standard way to throw our face into the Pacific Ocean. Luo Nan grunted. That proves that Her Majesty Empress Wu feels that interfering would be a big problem. Chapter 993. Zhang Yingying was startled. What do you mean? Luo Nan's gaze drifted erratically between the sea and the sky. What I mean is that we might have been targeted. At the very least, that ox demon has certainly been targeted by something. Of course, I'm not talking about that battleship slicing blade. It's not the battleship slicing saber. Are you saying that the battleship slicing saber is under someone's control? Yeah, he probably wants to rush to the periphery. Luo Nan responded unhurriedly. Right now his attention only occasionally swept across the scene of the pursuit. The vast majority of his attention was cast towards the gloomy clouds in the sky. Influenced by him, Zhang Yingying also looked up at the sky. Up there? Luo Nan answered honestly, I'm not sure. I just feel like I'm being spied on. Perhaps I can ask Her Majesty Empress Wu for guidance. Wait a minute, you said maybe. Both you and the boss are not sure? Zhang Yingying blinked her eyes. She finally grasped the main point of Luo Nan's word. Hey, think about the cage theory. You can't just randomly spout these words. That is the truth. Luo Nan extended his hand and water vapor condensed on his fingertip. It seemed that he wanted to write something, but in the end, he dispersed it. Contact is a violation. It's one-sided. The other party has done it quite brilliantly. Zhang Yingying opened her mouth again, but before she could say anything, several messages had already exploded in the group. Not only did they come at the same time, but the content was also surprisingly consistent. Extraordinary? No way. Zhang Yingying couldn't accept it. According to the explanation of Luo Nan's prison theory, being able to exert unilateral monitoring on the mental plane proved that one possessed a clear advantage in the depth and breadth of mental senses. And who was the one being monitored? Luo Nan, the world-renowned master of mental senses. He was suspected to be an extraordinary. Her Majesty Empress Wu was a genuine extraordinary. To be able to make the two of them feel that it was troublesome and that they couldn't find the source of the problem, they could only look for an opponent at the extraordinary level. Not only was he an extraordinary, but he was also a master of the mental side, which was beyond imagination. It's not that exaggerated. Luo Nan knew that Zhang Yingying and the others were overthinking things. He explained a bit more. The opponent's senses aren't direct. It's just that it's very good at using the medium. The battleship slicing blade was one of the mediums. Many of the surrounding fish and mutants were the same. We still can't figure out where the other party is because a large portion of these living beings have already been tampered with. They are equivalent to preset sensors. In this way, exposing ourselves to these guys is equivalent to exposing ourselves to that person's eyes. These sensors only send out signals. They are everywhere, in the sky and under the sea. It's a mess. The one responsible for the surveillance should have a special frequency receiver that could receive and decode the signals. We can find the transmitter, but we can't find the receiver, that's all. Some of the more technical details didn't need to be discussed. Luo Nan just summarized. In short, we've been tagged. There's a high possibility that it's an extraordinary, but it's a strong enemy. Let's keep watching. Zhang Yingying asked, what's the reason? There's the factor of distance. The psionic wave signal sent out should be very suitable for long-distance transmission, just like radio or infrasonic waves. From the looks of it, the monitor might be very far away. In addition, I feel that if they really have bad intentions towards us, they wouldn't have exposed themselves just because of a cow ghost. If it weren't for the battleship slicing blade receiving a clear command to pursue, it would be very hard for me to detect the fishy nature of these mutants. Unfortunately, the command was very short. It was only for a moment. By the time I reacted, it would be hard for me to pursue them. Zhang Yingying still wanted to get to the bottom of things. In the end, what kind of trick is this? It's similar to a transformation of a prosthetic? It's quite complicated to explain in detail. To put it simply, it's like inserting an antenna. Wouldn't it be more intuitive to say that it's a parasite? The phenomenon of parasites is quite common in the ocean. Zhang Yingying seemed to understand, but she didn't. You're saying that the other side is using some sort of parasite to achieve the purpose of receiving and sending signals. My God, what do you think? Luo Nan shrugged. I'll just observe more. Plus, this is just a preliminary result. I feel like this is the case. I'll have to follow up and observe the specific. I'll tell you later? No need. No need. Zhang Yingying waved her hand over and over again. It was a bit difficult for the others to sort out clear clues from Luonan's words. Comparatively speaking, it was easier for them to open their minds. It can't really be that, right? Papercut began to brood over his own words. He grew more and more unwilling to speak. How could there be such a coincidence? Didn't you just say that Diamond K is mainly active in the South Pacific? Nanster has been heading north ever since he left D-City. The routes have been staggered. The more Octopus put forth his arguments, the more guilty he gave others. Diamond K, Poseidon. Luonan had heard of this legendary mutant before. However, he was influenced by ancient myths and unconsciously thought of this fellow as a human. Now that he recalled the relevant information, he was actually unable to recall a more concrete image. He asked Meng Chong, who was beside him, "What species did Poseidon mutate from? A whale?" There's no specific image." This statement was more or less outside of Luonan's expectations. "No?" Meng Chong nodded slightly. "Yes. Legend has it that when Poseidon appears, there will always be gales and huge waves in the ocean. Large amounts of marine life are the precursors. He is one with the ocean. He is extremely mysterious." Meng Chong looked at the ocean when he spoke to this point. He was suddenly unable to continue speaking. A series of dull or dark emojis were sent in the group. Zhang Yingying glared at him. "Old Meng, you're doing this on purpose." Meng Chong lowered his eyelids. "That's what the relevant information says." Zhang Yingying choked. She was actually unable to refute. Luonan was very curious. No one has ever seen his true appearance? Then how do you know if he's Poseidon or not? If someone wants to kill someone and steal their goods, they can just use a storm to push the blame onto him. Isn't that a bit too easy? The truth is that it's very easy to confuse. It's said that within the small circle of extraordinaries, there are ways to distinguish if someone is Poseidon or not. However, there are also people who are very good at using this method. For example, Nick, the most vicious and evil pirate extraordinaire. It's said that he used Poseidon's name to do many priceless transactions. I think I've heard of this person before, but for an extraordinaire to be a pirate. Zhang Yingying sneered. It's because he did too many shitty things on shore, causing everyone to join forces to hunt him down. He could only hide in the ocean. Don't stray from the topic. Don't stray from the topic. Isn't talking about Poseidon straying from the topic? I really want to run a bit. Meng Chong continued to return to the topic of Poseidon amidst Zhang Yingying's grumbling. Because of Poseidon's mysterious characteristics, a kind of worship has developed in T-City, Two-City, and other ocean cities. A few small mysterious orders have formed, and they revere him as the will of the ocean. Most of them are fragmented and unsystematic. But even under these circumstances, some rituals are effective, and they are quite consistent. With this evidence, we can basically be certain that there is some sort of extraordinary power watching the past in the domain of orders. I'm sorry. This is too anthropomorphic. Perhaps it's more objective to call it resonance. Luonan keenly grasped the strand of meaning within Meng Chong's words. You're comparing the will of the ocean and the will of the blood flame? Meng Chong hesitated for a moment, but he still said, "The personification of faith has never been what we want." Luonan nodded. The vast majority of the world doesn't change based on people's desires. However, in a place as small as Earth, I also feel that it's very tasteless to call oneself a god. Everyone could hear that Luonan's words had stirred something, but no one could guess the specific trigger. Whether it was the front deck or the group of friends, no one responded for a time. In the end, Luonan laughed. "Since you're not sure which one it is, then don't put your mind into pondering over the most troublesome part. Poseidon certainly isn't the only extraordinaire level mutant in the Pacific Ocean, right?" "That's true. Just the South Pacific alone is a bit more active. You can put together a table of mahjong." I won't play mahjong with them today. Zhang Yingying gave him a virtual kick. Forget it. I'll go ask the boss and see what she says. Maybe she already knows what's going on. Meng Chong spoke at practically the same time. Mister, it won't be easy to disperse the shoals of fish and mutants that have followed us. But it's best to specially deal with that cow ghost. What Meng Chong said was a prudent argument. It was very clear that the cow ghost was a key point. Before the other side showed any obvious hostility, it might be better for both sides to chase the unstable factors far away. Luonan went, "Oh," before he could respond. Not too far away on the surface of the sea, the cow ghost made another turn as it fled. It practically stuck to the front of the enormous waves stirred up by the gales ahead. It was like a Qigong expert chasing a cicada in 8 steps on a precipitous wall. With a few successive strokes, it borrowed the force of the waves to quickly make a turn. It stuck to the enormous waves that had already rolled inward, narrowly avoiding the pursuit from behind. Right now its direction was already parallel to the direction of the yacht. Comparatively speaking, the battleship's slicing blade was reckless. Its charging momentum didn't decrease in the slightest as it forcibly pierced through the enormous waves. It was as if it was a thin piece of paper. Similar scenes had already occurred many times before. One didn't need to look to know that the mutant blade eel would once again cleave through the enormous waves in less than half a second to slaughter its way back. Therefore, the cow ghost, which had just avoided a calamity, didn't stop at all. Its 8 sharp limbs lightly sliced across the surface of the sea. Neither the waves nor the mutants within the waves were able to obstruct it in the slightest. It chased the side of the yacht, and in a few moments, it had snatched some distance from the bow of the yacht. It was about to begin its next round of detours. But this time, it didn't snatch it. It was as if a solid wall had suddenly been erected in the air in front of the yacht. It was formless and colorless, but it was harder than steel. This fellow's head smashed into it, and its entire body shook violently. It wasn't able to move even a millimeter forward in space. Practically all of the rebounding force acted on its body. It only stiffened for an instant before going limp. The yacht just happened to catch up to it at high speed, sending it flying. It then ran over it a second time, submerging it within the dense flood of seawater and living beings. Chapter 994. Not only did Luonan and the others on the front deck see the entire tragic fate of Niu Gui, they also heard the 3 consecutive sounds of impact. Even the violent winds and giant waves were unable to completely suppress it. It felt like the bones and muscles were completely shattered. It was hair-raising. Actually, the battleship's slicing blade that pierced through the giant wave earlier than Niu Gui did not return at all. After the wave that obscured their line of sight smashed down, the swift and fierce gray figure could no longer be seen. Zhang Yingying didn't even have time to enter the cabin when she saw these changes. She was a bit stupefied. What's going on? And over there? Did it run away? It's dead. Huh. Luonan could confirm that the instant the battleship's slicing blade pierced through the wave, a small portion of the seawater that had been sliced apart instantly condensed into extremely fine crystals. It formed a hollow blade ring along its path of travel, and the internal diameter of the extremely sharp crystal tip was just a bit narrower than the battleship's slicing blade. The body passed through, from head to tail, the abdomen was cut open, and the back was completely torn apart. If the body was going to be put into the pot, then a few more cuts would have been enough. Luonan grinned. Her Majesty Empress Wu was truly ruthless. Both techniques were simple to the extreme, but the crystallization of the body and the diamond wall of energy were both sharp and hard. They were practically done to the extreme. This was the effect of pure material conversion, but it was created by the extremely efficient mutual interference between the mental and the material. Luonan could only see this. Then he understood that Her Majesty Empress Wu's strength, especially her understanding of material properties, was truly unfathomable. No wonder she was able to invent a godly technique like the condensation ring. Luonan couldn't help but think at times like this. This lady just became an extraordinary half a year ago? She must be lying, right? Regardless of whether she was lying or not, Her Majesty Empress Wu was undoubtedly doing this to express her attitude. She was expressing a meaning to the fellow spying on her in the dark. She had no inclination for now, but she was seriously dissatisfied. Her Majesty Empress Wu's attitude was established, but the other party didn't make any intense reactions. However, the feeling of spying still remained. It was extremely stable. Well, it would be strange if it wasn't stable. Zhang Yingying received a call at this time. Boss says that this is a coward. She doesn't have the mood to care about him. She'll leave him to you. Oh, okay. Luonan answered quite delightfully. Luonan had no objections to the arrangements of Her Majesty Empress Wu. After all, the abnormal gathering of marine aberrations that served as the spy tools for the so-called cowards was mostly his fault. Of course, he had to bear part of the responsibility. Besides, he did not want to simply drive them away and clear the area. On one hand, his experiment could not be interrupted. He knew that there were problems with some of the experimental subjects, but time was tight and the experimental conditions were limited. It was not easy to gather a large number of experimental subjects, so he had to be careful every minute and second. On the other hand, it's really interesting. He was studying the magneto-optical mica, which had a high degree of interference with the will of living beings, when a fellow who also had some kind of control ability followed him without a sound. Is it a coincidence? Luonan didn't quite believe it. Even if it couldn't rise to the level of a conspiracy theory, perhaps it was some sort of special attraction? This phenomenon was worth studying. It was precisely because Luonan had agreed too quickly that many people were rather suspicious. Did someone want to cause trouble again? Luonan chuckled under Zhang Yingying's suspicious gaze. He reminded her with good intentions, Her Majesty Empress Wu seems to know who that fellow is. Aren't you going to ask? This. Zhang Yingying was the one who brought it up first, but she was a little hesitant. Go! Bring back some good news. It's best to reject the option of Diamond K. Don't forget about your friend who's worried for you thousands of miles away. Luonan didn't wait for Luonan to continue persuading her. The group of people in his group of friends had already reached out with their little hands one after another. They wanted to drag Zhang Yingying to find Her Majesty Empress Wu in order to alleviate the hunger brought about by curiosity. If the boss doesn't want to talk, then what's the point of looking for her? Though she said this, Zhang Yingying was unable to restrain herself. She scratched her hair, which had been drenched by the seawater, and made her way to the back of the cabin in 2 or 3 steps. She turned her head fiercely just as she entered the cabin door. She stared at Luonan. Why can't I be at ease? Don't mess around by all means, okay? Luonan looked at her innocently. What the hell are you talking about? This was clearly arranged by Her Majesty Empress Wu. Luonan's calm attitude was more or less a bit confusing. Coupled with her soaring curiosity, Zhang Yingying went to find her boss in the end. Only Luonan and Meng Chong were left on the front deck. Luonan maintained his silence when he wasn't asked. He was like a statue. He wouldn't budge an inch even if great waves crashed against him. Aside from his body that occasionally flickered with red light, there was nothing else eye-catching about him. Luonan didn't like it, but he was more accustomed to this sort of atmosphere. He narrowed his eyes, and his senses began to focus. They pointed toward the gloomy sky, deep within the cloud layer. There, the special structure of mica was spreading out, covering a wider and wider region of the cloud layer. It also formed an even closer two-way connection with the enormous number of life forms in the sea. Why did Luonan's experiment have to be shifted to the sea? This was because the mica, which had already touched upon the edge of the prototypical lifeform's matrix configuration, could only have the space to further transform itself through the high-frequency, dense, and repetitive connection with a large number of life forms. This was also the foundation for the fantasy school to realize the leap. Luo Nan referred to the theories and materials of the fantasy school, and he knew what he needed to do. He firmly held onto the cornerstone of the super-configuration theory. He wasn't in a rush to seek high-end results. Instead, he carried out design on the fundamental level of matter, evolving it step by step, observing it extensively, and filtering it. Luo Nan had done things very well before. He relied on the half-ruined brain array of the cloud organism to derive and evolve the basic structure of the magnetic optical mica step by step, forming the results of the mica. But as he continued down the path, especially in the aspect of observation and filtering, it really wasn't an easy task to obtain sufficient basic data in order to ensure the experimental environment. The magnetic optical mica was a fantasy school. Its ideal environment for growth was the collective fantasy and belief projection of millions and millions of highly intelligent life forms. Even though these basic tasks had already been somewhat replaced by highly generalized configurations, a need was a need. It was impossible to completely replace it. Just the few dozen people on the beach weren't enough to support the necessary environmental conditions. Of course, the population would be denser if the experiment was conducted in a super-metropolis like T-City. But Luo Nan was embarrassed to conduct this kind of experiment on ordinary people with unknown dangers. Plus, the moods of modern people were complex and ever-changing. Their thinking was light and not thick. For a newborn mica, this really wasn't a good resource. The average level of intelligence of marine species was far inferior to that of a metropolis if the experiment was moved to the sea. But as the largest unified biological chain on Earth, it was reasonable to carry out an idealized combing and rectification of the laboratory type on the basis of the powerful desires and instincts of the large number of mutants. Reality was just like this. As the mica cast out millions and millions of control lines, it unceasingly rubbed and interfered with the life forms of the ocean. Within its structural system, a kind of subtle and fine characteristic that exceeded the designed structural function itself suddenly appeared and then flickered and extinguished. And with the passage of time, the mutant species that possessed a higher level of intelligence gradually increased in number. The number of times the electrical fire appeared grew more and more frequent. The time it existed grew longer and longer. At the same time, it interfered with the material and mental planes, forming a buzzing noise. This kind of weak psychic wave was quickly submerged in the chaotic atmospheric environment on the material plane. Only a small amount of traces remained on the mental plane. But the level of effect they had was extremely high. The vast majority of them were in the abyss region. Only an extremely small amount was unable to avoid leaking into the sea of consciousness due to the existence of the millions and millions of control lines. In Luo Nan's eyes, the process of the psychic wave's creation and annihilation always radiated a complex and unique radiance. If he were to boldly consider it, could this be magnetic light? The magnetic light of the magneto-mica? Luo Nan needed to verify whether this was reality or just a figment of his imagination. But at this initial stage of seeing results, the coward outside of the experimental design, the factor appeared. Luo Nan needed to divide some of his energy to distinguish and analyze this unexpected factor. He needed to evaluate its influence on this series of experiments. If there was no major interference, then it was fine. Otherwise, of course, he needed to deal with it as soon as possible. Luo Nan still did not know who the extraordinary level expert that Her Majesty Empress Wu called a coward was. He was unable to find its specific location, but it wasn't completely impossible to say that he had no understanding of it. From Luo Nan's perspective, the characteristics of the extraordinary were quite easy to identify. This coward had done something to the bodies of large numbers of shoals of fish and mutants in advance. It had collected information and disseminated it in a manner similar to radio. Then it was received, making it impossible for others to determine its location. However, the collection, aggregation, and transmission of information were not the natural abilities of these marine life forms. In order for them to complete this task, some modifications were needed, more or less. In a similar situation, some organizations of orders, such as the two members of the Amaterasu order and Luonan, sometimes used the method of believers. They used the power of faith on the mental plane as a base to build a kind of super-connection structure in the pure mental domain. Then it seeped downwards to share the perceptual framework of the believers, achieving the effect of "what you see is what I see." The super-connection of the believers was relatively restrained. If the God only used the perception of the believers in a pure and one-sided manner, and if the God did not interfere frequently and forcefully, it would be hard for Luonan to detect it. Walking on the street, one could tell who belonged to who order with a single glance. Who was a believer? In any case, Luonan was unable to do it. But clearly, the coward didn't use this method. Luonan raised his eyes to look at these marine life forms. The modifications they received were relatively more extroverted. At least, this was what Luonan believed. Chapter 995. At this time, Luonan's telepathic thoughts were shuttling in and out of the cloudy mica. They flowed through the millions and millions of control threads, and they even followed the control threads to pass through the surrounding marine life forms. Most of the time, he looked at the whole, but he would sometimes focus on the individual. From his perspective, perhaps a single control thread was nothing. But when these nearly incorporeal threads formed groups and bundles, they stroked the boundary between the material and the mental. They permeated into the body and soul frame of every living being. They actually had quite the effect of a syncopator. This kind of infinite syncopation, infiltration, and even dissociation towards the fundamental level was like the most thorough X-ray vision. He could clearly see the inside and outside of the target. At the same time, he used his high sensitivity towards the superconfiguration system to unearth the deeper meaning of the system's structure behind the basic module functions. Under this kind of clairvoyance, the whole and the individual reflected and analyzed each other. The targets that had been tampered with, what kind of differences existed in the depths of their body and soul structure compared to a normal life system? What kind of commonalities did these differences manifest? How did the individual operate? How did they integrate with each other? All sorts of things were peeled off layer by layer, appearing clearly. After seeing so much, Luonan wasn't too sure if this was the ability of the mica itself, or if it was a reflection of his own thoughts, or if it was a completely new system that interfered and influenced each other. From the looks of it, the possibility of a complete restoration of the magneto-optical mica was very low. For a configuration designer, certain signs were like sprouts that had just broken through the soil. Even if it was in its initial stage, whether it had grown crooked or not, and how it was nourished, Luonan could roughly see it. Luonan couldn't help but ponder a bit more, but these thoughts only flashed in his mind before they were soon annihilated. This was because this was something unavoidable. Using the natural evolution mode of primal chaos meant that one had to bear this kind of result. Cosmic object analysis. He had always been used to this kind of joke. If a magneto-optical mica could be casually replicated, then the sky of the heavenly Yuan Empire would have long been covered by mountains of clouds. Luonan didn't forget that his ultimate goal wasn't to create a magneto-optical mica. He just hoped to obtain the corresponding basic structure and extrapolate the space-time parameters on this basis. It was fine as long as they were roughly the same. He wasn't picky. In any case, under this kind of clairvoyance, the following torrent of marine life forms had practically no secrets from Luonan. He could analyze and separate the aspects of the system from multiple levels and dimensions. He could even try to restore the evolution process of the entire system with the superconfiguration theory that he was gradually familiar with. Luonan was able to confirm that foreign parasites more or less existed on the bodies of all the marine life forms that had been touched. It looked like a fish or a bug that had drilled into the target's body. The half that had drilled in had melted and fused with the host's flesh and nerve. In this way, it was partially modified and penetrated the host's body layer by layer. There was still a small part that was exposed outside as an antenna for receiving and sending signals. In this way, a parasitic device was formed. From the looks of it, this flesh parasitic device did not have much of an intention to usurp the host's position. Most of the hosts were still unaware of it. Ordinary fish were still muddle-headed, and the tyrannical aberrations also possessed self-awareness. At most, they would unconsciously gather and transmit some information. However, Luonan didn't forget about the battleship's slicing blade that had its belly split open. Overall evaluation: interesting but crude. What was interesting was that this kind of biological method could carry out limited modifications and control of the host. It was simply a kind of flesh dynamo core. It was peculiar and quite effective. It was crude because it was affected by the characteristics of living things. The host was different and the effects were different. It was also affected by repulsion, producing different degrees of mutation. Its precision was really not high. Therefore, a large number of similar devices were needed to be assembled together to form a cluster layout. This was to eliminate the effects of errors and to restore and transmit information more effectively. As for the final score, amazing. Luonan felt that some methods did not depend on precision. Instead, it depended on whether the direction was correct or not. His own knowledge and insight were mostly formed from the fragmented information flood of the Sunwheel Prison and the Mist Labyrinth. His system wasn't that great. However, thanks to the external neuron, he had several dozen hours of training in the Innerverse simulator. This allowed him to possess a relatively clear and advanced system insight. Right now, when he judged something, he would unconsciously use the standards of the Heavenly Yuan Empire to measure it. He wanted to see what kind of position it occupied in the Heavenly Abyss Civilization's academic system of generic knowledge, specialized knowledge, and the Heavenly Ladder. With this sort of insight, the depth of many problems was expanded in an instant. Things like the flesh dynamo core had quite a market in the Heavenly Yuan Empire. It was usually used on permanently growing dynamo cores. It involved extremely high-end research in genetic engineering and smelting furnace layout. Even though this sort of parasitic method was extremely backward, with uneven infiltration and transformation, and quality needed to be exchanged for quantity, the level of the method could be reflected. How to integrate these uneven devices into a relatively smooth system, how to effectively carry out information filtering and control, and even how to form a special domain structure. Wasn't this the homework Luonan had forced Hood, Shinha, and the other experimental devices to work hard to complete during his beach experiments? This was a confirmed path that the Heavenly Abyss Civilization's advanced system construction research had already verified. Even the super configuration theory had a considerable portion built upon similar experience and theoretical foundations. It didn't matter if this coward was doing this intentionally or if it was just a coincidence. Luonan just happened to walk on this bumpy yet bright path in the path of mutation evolution. Luonan needed to pay special attention to him. It was fine if he was right once, but he was right twice in a row. This was a true power, no doubt about it. Luonan's observation and judgment of the coward continued, just like how the other side continued to monitor and evaluate him. Everyone was restraining each other quite well. Not only did the other party have a tolerant attitude towards Her Majesty Empress Wu's methods, even the control over the mutant sensors in the surroundings was very good. Apart from the battleship slicing blade, the others were only used as sensor unit. Without further control, most of the mutants were still ignorant and unaware. Luonan could endure the side effects of having a large number of parasitic and transformed mutants constantly monitoring him for the sake of continuing his experiment. On the other hand, the millions and millions of control threads that Micah had cast were similar to what the other side was doing. They were merely observing and experiencing the complex interactions between living beings. They had yet to truly control anything. Therefore, the two completely different control systems had very little influence and interference with each other on the same target. They were separated by a thin layer of paper window that could be broken with a single poke. They contrasted with each other, creating shadows. It was both tense and interesting. At least, this was what Luonan thought. Since the other side had this sort of attitude, Luonan's personality wasn't suited to use overly active method. He would observe first. Luonan didn't take any action for a period of time. He just minded his own business and did his own experiment. He continued to observe and collect data, searching for the most suitable direction for Micah's development. Zhang Yingying ran to the driver's seat to inquire, but the result was as expected. She ended up without any problems. Her Majesty Empress Wu was all smiles. She was very cordial, but she just said things like, "It's hard to confirm, and I'll just observe a bit longer." Then she minded her own business and enjoyed the joy of driving to the limit. She completely ignored Zhang Yingying's coquettish behavior and Luonan's wailing in the group chat. Comparatively speaking, Luonan appeared to be a bit more honest. He took some time out to observe some of the circumstances, mainly the key elements of the parasitic transformation, into the group. He let everyone satisfy their cravings, and he helped them look up information in passing. Unfortunately, even a master of information retrieval like Bamboo Pole would not be able to find the correct answer in a short amount of time. After all, the ocean was far too vast. After the era of distortion, old species were dying and new species were born every moment. Comparatively speaking, human research and exploration was far too lagging behind. Moreover, research on extraordinaries was still mostly confined within a small circle. It was relatively closed off. Everyone was at the peak of their lives. No one was willing to place themselves on the dissecting table so early, right? The work of clarifying the identity of the coward had temporarily come to a standstill. Luonan didn't pay too much attention to it. Right now, his main focus was still on researching and collecting more basic data. He wanted to experience the special life and death mechanism of magneto-optic. He wanted to attempt to use superconfiguration theory to explain and restore it. Or perhaps he wanted to give it a more concrete configuration. Frankly speaking, his progress in this area was even more stagnant than his work on identifying the identity of the coward. Luonan knew where the crux of the problem lay. Right now, there were already 70 to 80,000 marine life forms built around the yacht, including ordinary shoals of fish and mutants. They formed a shallow sea life zone that extended for several dozen nautical miles. There was no lack of powerful C-rank and B-rank life forms. They had already begun to rely on their instincts to occupy territory and food. Conflicts of varying sizes erupted in the hundreds. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that the sea had turned red along the way. There were countless corpses. Luonan heard from Zhang Yingying that this abnormal gathering had already attracted the attention of the Coastal Defense remote sensing satellite. They had already made 3 or 4 phone calls, but they didn't follow up after learning that Her Majesty Empress Wu and Luonan were here. But the problem was that the number of creatures squeezed together was close to 100,000. Compared to the growth and evolution requirements of the mica, the base number was far too small. After all, the base number of normal magneto-optic mica to help it grow was in the hundreds of millions. Of the 70 to 80,000 life forms, the majority were low-end shoals of fish. On this basis, rubbing the psychic waves of magneto-optic metamorphosis could only be done. They flickered and disappeared. They weren't on a large scale. Even observation was strenuous, let alone analysis and reconstruction. Luonan had tried his usual method of sketching, hoping to trace and leave an image of the magneto-optic. However, the life and death of the magneto-optic were indeterminate. Even though it flashed in his mind thousands of times, it was still specious. He couldn't find a place to start. Luonan tried a few more times. He felt that his fingertips weren't condensing water vapor. Instead, they were spurting out electric fire. They crackled and splashed. It was a complete mess. Chapter 996. Calm down. Calm down. Even with Luonan's temperament, it was hard for him to not be a bit impatient after failing so many times. Fortunately, he reacted in time. He realized that he was a bit impatient for success, so he calmed down a bit. He simply split a bit of his energy to compare what he saw at the moment. He casually picked up his pen and drew a simplified sketch. He borrowed the hexair several thousand kilometers away to copy it and send it to his group of friends. What the F***CK? The group of people who were searching for information or simply shouting 666 to the side accidentally saw that Luonan had personally sent the message. It was a hand-drawn sketch. Those who knew of Luonan's current state felt a chill at the back of their heads. They felt that Luoyui might crawl over from the internet in the next moment to chat with them face to face. Shuele didn't think too much about it. He was just curious. This is a shark, right? It looks like a mutant rat shark. It's commonly known as a hovercraft. It's the speed type. It can dash forward at high speeds while sticking close to the surface of the sea. Its instantaneous burst of speed can break the sound barrier. But that's all. Bamboo Pole was the most meticulous of them all. When Inying gave the camera, this group of fellows were hunting in the periphery. Holy crap! These lines. You have quite the heavy taste. Octopus timely complimented. Hee, if you can draw an anatomical drawing like this, I'll give you my exact words. I'm a pharmacist, not a surgeon. But it really is beautiful. Also, this isn't an anatomical drawing. It's a 3D perspective drawing. Octopus clicked his tongue in wonder. Luonan's drawing really had a grasp on the application of lines to the pinnacle of precision. It wasn't just a simple design. It went deep into the flesh, the muscles, the bones, the nerves, and even the organs. There were practically no superfluous strokes. The fine branches and forks inside were like burrs, and they all conformed to the arrangement of the blood vessels and nerves. Of course, biological structures were complex, and there were also orders of magnitude differences in scale. Although this sketch was called a sketch, it didn't cover everything. At first glance, it was enough to see that the details were appropriate and the key points were highlighted. Bamboo Pole, Octopus, and the others didn't need to use their brains to see the perspective drawing of this mutant rat shark. There were a few key points that had been highlighted, and with just a little concentration, one would be able to confirm that those parts were the core structures that the mutated rat sharks used to achieve extraordinary powers. There was also the germ-independent module, which had a mysterious function beyond this set of structural systems, as well as the deeper infiltration routes and areas of influence. Luonan had borrowed Micah's control line segmentation function to create a comprehensive reconstruction of the mutant rat shark. Using this picture, he chatted with his friends and sorted out his emotions. This is a more typical biomass transformation, but there's one that's not typical. It seems like the transformation didn't succeed. As he spoke, Luonan sent another picture over. He added, "So even Her Majesty Empress Wu has differential treatment." The group fell silent. On one hand, Luonan had the qualifications to court death. The others didn't have the guts to do so. On the other hand, the newly sent 3D perspective drawing served as ironclad evidence. It really left everyone speechless. The subject of Luonan's most recent painting was none other than the cowardly mutant that had lured the cowardly mutant over. That fellow had smashed into the diamond wall of energy. Then, it had been rammed and then crushed by the high-speed cruising yacht. It looked to be in a much more miserable state than the battleship Slicing Blade, who had inexplicably died. But when Luonan looked at it, it was actually still alive. There really was a difference in Her Majesty Empress Wu's deadly hand. Both Her Majesty Empress Wu had subdued the enemy in one move. 2 unlucky mutants. One was dead, and the other didn't seem to be alive. In fact, it was still struggling, and its condition was getting better and better. Right now, the mutant ox was wrapped up by the mutant population within the seawater. It continued to follow the yacht, waving its limbs from time to time as it struggled to fend off the predators that attempted to take a bite out of it. As for its condition getting better and better, perhaps it was because Her Majesty Empress Wu was being lenient. Or perhaps it was because Her Majesty Empress Wu had indeed gone easy on it. It could be seen from the 3D perspective drawing that Luo Nan had drawn that there was something similar to a fluid in the connection between its bulging chest and abdomen. It was interacting with the other regions of its body. No matter how vivid the finished drawing was, it was impossible to completely display the details of its movement. Compared to his friends in the group, Luo Nan was able to clearly see that it was actually a kind of dark green fluorescence. It was flowing out in an orderly manner. It looked like its function was to help the shattered muscles, bones, and muscles of the mutant ox recover quickly. From Luo Nan's perspective, the level and mode of the fluorescent fluid's function were a bit strange. Luo Nan's thoughts stirred slightly, and a set of control wires dropped down from the Mother Mica. They pointed directly at the mutant ox's location, adding a bit more material to it, allowing it to carry out a more detailed probe. His main probe point was the strange fluorescent area between the chest and abdomen of the mutant ox. Of course, he didn't overlook the outer layer of this area. The flesh parasitic device had already probed in, but the majority of it had been dissolved. The degree of dissolution had already far surpassed all the other parasitic marine life forms that Luo Nan had observed. The device was completely unable to display its proper function. That makes sense. Perhaps it was because the parasitic failure of the flesh dynamo core had attracted the extra attention of that coward. As for why it had failed, Luo Nan definitely had to look for the reason in the fluorescent area. The control wires that Luo Nan probed in didn't suffer from any power of dissolution. The mutant ox was currently struggling to survive. It was completely unaware of the penetration of the control wires. But the marvelous fluorescent itself clearly possessed a bit of an autonomous response. Its consciousness was much sharper than the mutant ox's. It was just that the effective reaction to the control wires had already far exceeded the reaction limits of the fluorescent light. There was only a slight fluctuation, and then there was nothing else. Being able to sense it was quite amazing. Luo Nan was more or less a bit surprised. In all fairness, the current Mother Mica, even if it was based on the magnetic photon mica, was still relatively small and weak. Luo Nan estimated that the intensity of its life aura on the material plane was roughly equivalent to that of a normal awakened. But this didn't take into account the special existence of its mixing with the water vapor cloud, as well as the higher-end super configuration system. Especially the latter. In order to realize the complex structure of the super configuration system and provide timely energy support, its core framework had long since probed into the abyss region. It occupied the first opportunity in the interaction and interference with the material plane. Then there was the infusion of configuration and super configuration theory. The nothingness of the control wires, which naturally carried out high-dimensional segmentation, seemed to be mixed with a bit of Luo Nan's pure observation ability. Under these circumstances, let alone the mutant ox, even a psychic extraordinary might not be able to clearly see through it in a short amount of time. The actual reactions of the hundreds and thousands of mutants in the surrounding sea region were powerful proofs of the concealment properties of the control wires, which were practically separated by a dimension. In comparison, the fluorescent light locked within the mutant ox's body was much more powerful. The fluorescent light was able to react in an instant. It was clearly on a different level compared to the mutants, including the mutant ox. TSK. From the looks of it, the one who dissolved the flesh parasitic device might not be the mutant ox, huh? Luonan very naturally made a preliminary judgment. Although the mutant ox was the one who carried and stored this dark green fluorescent light, it could be used by the mutant ox. However, the relationship between the two couldn't be simply defined as belonging to the mutant ox. Everything must have a beginning and an end. Luonan still remembered that he was currently sending the results of his observation to his group of friends. He had gotten used to this during class, so he brought everyone along to adjust their point of view to focus on this fluorescent light. This area is more interesting than the mutant ox. Wait for me to draw another map. We're going to zoom in. It's going to increase by roughly 2 orders of magnitude. The people in the group were certainly unable to follow up with the conditions of the live broadcast. They lacked direct perception. Shuele was a bit stupefied. What's 2 orders of magnitude? It's roughly on the micron scale. This way it'll be clearer. The internal structure is quite complex. The main thing is that there are a lot of impurities. Wait for me. The group went silent for a moment. Octopus was the first to yell, Zhang Yingying, where the hell did you go? I'm going down. I'll be right there. With Luonan's current position, it didn't matter if his lecture was understood or not. He just needed to make a good record. Luonan didn't wait for Zhang Yingying to return from the cabin. He already had an embryonic form in regards to this fluorescent area. He turned the sketch around and even made a keynote. The vast majority of these are impurities. If I'm not wrong, this is the interference structure of the mutant ox's own strength. Only this little bit, the place I've marked, has a core effect. This is a bit like a super inferior version of the dripping sword. Although there are many configurations, the only one that has eternal value is the condensation ring and nothing more. Were kids these days all this straightforward when it came to courting death? Luonan wasn't aware of the unspoken criticism of his friends in the group. He was just discussing the matter as it stood. Let's continue down. The precision needs to be increased. Wait a moment. You speak as if you're pressing a button. Octopus finally couldn't hold back from ridiculing Luonan. He dealt with molecular formulas every day. He understood better than anyone what the microscopic scale represented. Although the precision of Luonan's current intervention was still 4 to 5 orders of magnitude lower than the molecular level, he was able to use his own ability to probe down to the micron scale. He was able to capture such a complex image. This in itself was an inconceivable achievement. Also, this tone was far too hateful. But this time, the wait a moment took a bit longer. Zhang Yingying had already dashed down. She aimed the camera at Luonan and restarted the live broadcast. But Luonan's extended index finger paused his follow-up actions. It looked like he was in a daze, but it also looked like, there's trouble. Luonan finally opened his mouth, but his finger deviated from its original direction. It poked at the edge of the enlarged fluorescent area. The sketch had already been blurred, and the flesh-parasitic device was mostly dissolved. All that was left of this toy on the mutant ox's body was the shape of a cigarette, but it barely hung on the outer wall of the muscle layer. But right at this moment, the tip of the remaining cigarette but suddenly lit up within Luonan's perception. It was as if it had been reignited. It burned through the gaps between the mutant ox's flesh, and a faint fiery light seeped through. It was as if an evil eye had opened in that location. Chapter 997. Zhang Yingying turned the camera to aim at the direction of Luonan's finger, but she couldn't figure anything out. She helplessly moved the camera back to Luonan's face. Did something really happen? Rather than saying this was a question, it was better to say that it was a confirmation. It was the relief of finally hearing the second sound of boots hitting the ground. Luonan was unwilling to pay attention to her. Zhang Yingying also felt that she was being a bit excessive, but the facts were laid before her eyes. She really couldn't hold back her curiosity. After confirming that it wasn't a dangerous and sudden change of events, she pursued the question. Have the other side attacked? Not yet, but we've been targeted. Haven't they been keeping an eye on us all this time? Passive radar and active radar are always different. Indeed, Zhang Yingying immediately thought of the cage theory. She used it as a foundation to carry out deductions. The situation Luonan was facing right now was suddenly far too complicated and far too dangerous. She suddenly didn't dare to speak, worried that she would disturb Luonan. Instead, Luonan grinned at her. "It's nothing. It's fine for now. I just need to take a look." I might not be able to understand, from Luonan's perspective, the flames of the cigarette, but really did play the role of an eye. The abilities it displayed were the abilities it should have in its complete form. Due to the destructive dissolution it had suffered long ago, its activity was close to zero. Its original sensing ability was also destroyed. But in any case, it was a receiving device. It could still become a highly effective interventional channel if there was a matching projection of power. However, it was just as Luonan said. The object that the other side was currently paying attention to was not something that could be easily understood. But then Luonan's smile froze a bit in the next moment. Zhang Yingying discovered the abnormality. "There's light in the sea?" "It's an eye." Following Luonan's determination, starting from the reignited cigarette but within Niu Gui's muscles, Luonan's sensing range began to take Niu Gui's location as the center. There were hundreds and thousands of mutants of all shapes and colors in the surroundings. Flames ignited at different locations on their bodies, whether they were inside or outside, whether they were visible or invisible. All of them had evil eyes opening. Some things were different when they were on a larger scale. As time passed, the evil eyes in the surrounding waters became brighter and brighter. It was to the extent that from any angle on the deck of the yacht, one would be able to see the specks of ghostly fire amidst the rolling waves. There wasn't any temperature, and it didn't even reflect any specific silhouettes. Those tyrannical aberrations were reduced to a gloomy background, only to serve as a foil to this bewitching light, as well as the deep spiritual pressure hidden behind the light. "Mada is in trouble." Zhang Yingying couldn't help but complain. At the same time, she aimed the floating camera at the sea below the deck, ready to adjust the focus to give these strange light spots a close-up view. But before she could complete her operation, these dim light sources, which Luonan called eyes, drove the heads and bodies of the thousands of mutants to twist in unison. They pointed towards a certain region beneath the yacht. That was where the struggling Niu Gui was. They didn't only point at the ox demon, but also at the fluorescent area between the ox demon's chest and abdomen, as well as the incorporeal control lines that had already entered the fluorescent area and were being dissected. At the very least, this was what Luonan believed. Not everyone could be like Luonan, grasping deep-level information. But the extremely abnormal synchronization of the sea creatures was enough to give off a feeling of existence that made one's heart palpitate. It was like a heavy hammer striking one's chest. Even though she wasn't the center of focus, Zhang Yingying's breathing still froze for a short period of time in this instant. The lens failed to focus, but it just so happened to capture the most orderly and most terrifying scene on the sea's surface. Through a satellite signal, it was projected to Xia City, several thousand kilometers away. It was just that the group of friends was no longer in high spirit. Anyone could see that the situation on the sea's surface had already reached a point where it could explode at any moment. In reality, at the moment when the evil eye suddenly revealed itself, the inevitable contact and collision had already arrived. Frankly speaking, the opponent's performance so far could be considered restrained. No matter how their methods changed, their goal was most likely just to take a look. The problem was that when it came to matters on the mental plane, hidden was hidden, and visible was visible. When the power behind the scenes transformed from hidden to visible, direct contact was placed right there. Once it appeared, it would be impossible to stop. At their level, sensing was contact. Contact was confrontation. Confrontation could decide life and death. who could remain calm and collected when a fatal threat was already at the back of their necks. Luonan was unable to do it. The opponent's control ability was also unable to reach the stage of transforming such terrifying psychic pressure into a spring breeze and rain. Luonan had to react. Compared to the yacht protected by Her Majesty Empress Wu, and his fake body that would not suffer any substantial damage even if it was smashed to smithereens, Luonan was most worried about the Mother Mica hidden within the abyssal region. After all, the opponent had already sensed it and displayed an enormous curiosity. Therefore, Luonan quickly projected his thoughts above the abyssal region. He revolved around the Mother Mica's hidden but fragile core configuration. He did his best to blur its specific location, and he began to construct layers of defensive power within the outer abyssal region storm. Luonan was worried that the improvised structure might not be strict, so he even brought the Blood Soul Temple of the abyssal region over. This allowed the temple to form a triangular formation with a balanced offense and defense. But all in all, Luonan still prioritized stability. This matched the opponent's performance of concentrated observation. Both sides had intentions and performances of restraint. However, both sides needed a sense of security and the corresponding measures they adopted. They would not play any positive role in reversing the current trend of the situation. At best, it was a slow poison. It slowly but firmly pulled the safe distance between the two sides closer and closer. Both sides' reactions gradually escalated. Just like now, soul strength was frequently mobilized above the abyssal region. The range of interference increased dramatically, causing the chaotic environment of the abyssal region to become even more vile. It faintly resonated with the raging winds and giant waves of the central Pacific Ocean. The effects of the storm nearly erased the barrier between the material plane and the mental plane in a trance. They ran wantonly on an even vaster plane. In Luonan's perception, the space-time structure of the surrounding sea region, which was originally relatively smooth, was like a gear with poor precision. From time to time, the space-time structure would stumble due to bad grinding. It would even tremble and throb, making creaking sounds. The atmosphere began to become abnormal. The first to be affected was the long-distance information transmission channel, which was originally unstable. The live video broadcast in her friend group struggled for a dozen seconds before it was completely cut off. Zhang Yingying was no longer in the mood to record. She turned her head to look at the cockpit high up in the rear, but she was completely unable to see Her Majesty Empress Wu's figure. She also did not receive the corresponding message. On the other hand, Zhang Yingying felt inexplicably uncomfortable due to the movements of her body. It was as if the powerful wind and waves that were beating against her body had suddenly leaked electricity. She felt numb, and her hair stood on end from the stimulation. Zhang Yingying's own cultivation was not ranked in the inner world, but she followed by Her Majesty Empress Wu's side. Her knowledge and experience were quite extensive. She immediately thought that this was most likely the aftermath of the collision of super-powerful forces on the mental plane. She turned her head to look at Luonan. Luonan just so happened to look at her. He did not say anything. He just extended his hand and pointed toward the cabin door. Zhang Yingying opened her mouth to speak, but she soon pursed her lips tightly. She nodded slightly, and without any delay, she headed toward the cabin door. Meng Chong followed behind her without a sound. He maintained a distance that could protect her at any time. However, Zhang Yingying could not help but turn her head to look again after she entered the cabin. This time, she saw that Luonan's finger had inexplicably congealed with water vapor. Amidst the battering waves, Luonan began to draw a new picture. Luonan slowly sketched out a few lines, but he did not have a particularly clear train of thought. He relied purely on his feelings. He did not deny that he was somewhat unable to restrain himself in this escalating confrontation, and the confrontation mode on the mental plane was destined to be one where seizing the initiative in terms of distance and level was the only feasible strategy. Right now, the other side was certainly the one taking the initiative, but that might not be the case later on. The traces of the other side's power taking the initiative to interfere increased due to the activation of the evil eye. This allowed Luo Nan to capture a few directional clues that penetrated through the void. The other side was actually extremely skilled in disguise. It was able to fully utilize the special environment of the abyssal region to create all sorts of labyrinth-like illusions for the projection of soul strength. By the time it truly sank into the sea of consciousness and made direct contact, the other side was already a greatly distorted and abnormal existence. However, how could Luo Nan's innate ability of pure observation, which came from formatting theory, be just for show? These confusing methods really didn't have much meaning to him. The reason why he had yet to find the other side was because he had broken the soul cloak himself. The current range of coverage was far from its peak. But then again, the soul cloak didn't seem to be a fatal influence to a psychic. Plus, there was still Mother Micah. Mother Micah's action of unleashing the control lines could be said to be obeying orders. It could be said to be an instinct of existence. To a certain degree, it possessed a certain degree of autonomy. Therefore, no matter how Luo Nan's thoughts changed in the void, no matter how the tens of thousands of bright and dark evil eyes lit up the sea of consciousness that closely interfered with the surrounding sea of consciousness, Mother Micah continued to throw out control lines. Because of the sudden activation of the evil eye, it naturally added a few more waves. The parasitic devices of flesh and blood were segmented on a deeper level. It must be known that the segmentation of the control lines had never been a matter of fact. Instead, it rapidly advanced towards a deeper domain. This was tantamount to giving Luo Nan another dimensional reference. Therefore, Luo Nan felt quite good. He felt that perhaps the answer had already appeared halfway through a picture. In fact, there was a faint shadow in Luo Nan's mind right now. It's better for everyone to be a bit more fair. Luo Nan muttered to himself. The lines of his pen were practically flying. But then there was a pause. At the same time, his finger, which had transformed into the tip of the pen, was broken. The fine water vapor collapsed and Luo Nan was stunned. Actually, on the mental plane above the abyssal region, the collision between the two sides didn't give them any leeway to be stunned. They directly formed the most intense collision reaction. As for the material plane, the first to suffer were the aberrations around the yacht. The tide of living beings of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, were like a wave of high-voltage electricity. They violently twitched and pulsed as they broke apart. Enormous yet deformed and ugly flowers bloomed. Chapter 998. The collision in the abyss region and the impact in the sea roared, interfered, and resonated with each other, separated by a paper-thin boundary barrier between the mental and the material. The collision originated from the abyss region, but compared to the highly chaotic storm environment of the abyss region, the magnitude of the changes on the material plane was greater. The kinetic energy formed was fiercer and more direct. Close to 10% of the 100,000 marine life forms that were instantly electrocuted were aberrations. They weren't dead fish on the chopping block. They had suddenly suffered an unexpected calamity. They were stupefied, but most of them had their ferocious nature aroused. They couldn't do anything to the yacht for the time being. They also suffered the impact of the terrifying psychic pressure. They instinctively felt a bit fearful of the collision and interference in the core region. They scattered outwards one after another for a time, but they soon strangled each other again. They massacred each other in the surroundings. Whether or not one could survive under the extreme chaos depended on one's strength and luck. For example, the aberration rat shark that had just become Luo Nan's target didn't have the chance to display its speed advantage in the sudden eruption of chaos and slaughter. It hadn't recovered from the rigidity of being electrocuted before it was submerged by the dense school of fish that swarmed over. It never floated up again. This was an insignificant corner of the bloody chaos in the surrounding sea region. Moreover, it was only a superficial phenomenon. Luonan wasn't paying attention to the chaotic scene or the resulting casualties. Instead, he was paying attention to the more subtle changes on a deeper level under the impact of the intense bloody and violent emotions. These marine life forms, especially those aberrations that were parasitized, had violent emotions bred in the bloody environment. They stimulated the body and soul framework in reverse, affecting the flesh and blood parasitic devices. Not only did they not cause distortions, they were like a wave of reverse charging, causing the myriad of evil eyes to become even brighter. Even more changes were reflected in the deeper regions that the naked eye couldn't see. The state of the marine life forms was changing. The segmentation of the mica naturally penetrated deeper, performing a deeper segmentation on the flesh and blood parasitic devices. Therefore, Luonan could see that these flesh and blood parasitic devices, or perhaps the flesh and blood dynamo core, were more in line with Luonan's aesthetic. These little things seemed to have activated their hidden mechanisms under the restless emotions of their hosts. They became more active, more proactive, and more direct. They induced their hosts to quickly burn their life force. While they provided their hosts with extraordinary strength, they also compensated for their low-end flaws and raised their upper limit. Luonan felt that they could even faintly form the embryonic form of an array under the premise of being piled up in quantity. And the structure of this array was not the straightforward and invincible military array of the bloodshed land. Instead, it was more similar to the domain of extraordinaries, which was more suitable for handling high-level power. It was also in such a domain that the tyrannical power of the coward from afar began to approach, oppress, and transform. This was something that couldn't be seen in the natural equilibrium state of the group of mutants. Speaking of which, that coward might have really restrained himself earlier. This kind of berserk state should be the normal state of the flesh dynamo core. In addition, Luonan discovered that the number of evil eyes that opened grew larger and larger, and the visible brightness grew stronger and stronger. But this part of the sea grew darker and darker as a whole. The sky had indeed darkened, and the Pacific Ocean region near the equator had gradually become nighttime. But Luonan believed that the most important factor was the radiation effect of the power of the coward who had entered the arena. The densely packed evil eyes were the most eye-catching targets above and below the surface of the sea. But after the enemy's power entered the arena, the evil eyes had already retreated to a secondary position. They were even more like bait. When one's attention was attracted by these light sources, the predator in the depths of the darkness would truly launch a surprise attack. It would bare its deadly fangs at one. Luonan still had an accurate grasp of the overall situation under the segmentation of Mother Mica. He wouldn't be confused by this kind of trap. He actually had some ideas. This sort of hunting method wasn't very effective in a frontal confrontation. The reason for this arrangement didn't seem to be a profound design. It was more like the habitual instincts of deep-sea life forms. And in comparison to the abnormal darkness of the material plane, there was another kind of arrangement within the storm of the abyss region. It was as if an enormous lighthouse had been erected there. It radiated an extremely penetrating power at all times. The upheaval of the abyss region was built upon the foundation of the mutants that were parasitized by the flesh dynamo core. Through the mutation effect of the flesh dynamo core and the continuous and orderly arrangement of the array, the enemy was carrying out some sort of blending and replacement of the berserk life energy that burst forth from the host. As a whole, low-level things were replaced layer by layer with a higher-level power. It was a bit like the structure of a burner. In other words, it was in line with the basic logic of the formation and upgrade of extraordinary powers. From Luonan's perspective, there were some redundancies in this structure, but there were some details that were extremely innovative. The most unique point was that although it was built upon the foundation of flesh and blood, it didn't care about the losses. It forcefully crossed the boundary between the mental and the material plane, transforming into a flame on the mental plane. To be more precise, it was a lighthouse on the sea. It attempted to illuminate the sea of consciousness and even the chaotic situation of the storm of the abyss region. This was a bit similar to the military drill of the Heavenly Yuan Empire that Luo Nan had learned at the relay station. However, the military drill that Luo Nan had learned at the relay station was to deal with the extremely dangerous, evil environment. He had no choice but to carry out strict restrictions. As for this side, was it a map? In any case, the powerful radiation of the lighthouse was extraordinarily effective. Perhaps it was because the spiritual lighthouse that was formed from aggregation was different from that of a single ability user. It didn't have a clear direction and purpose. It projected its light in all directions. The radiation method was relatively even, without any bias. This method actually maintained the relative stability of the environment of the abyss region to a certain degree. This caused the paradox of sensing and interfering to be alleviated to a certain extent. As for that person, he was still hidden outside the light of the lighthouse that he had single-handedly created. Since the distance was still extremely far, the projection of power was extremely high-end. Whether it was the darkness of the material plane or the light of the abyss region, he was able to illuminate others from beginning to end. He hid himself forever in the darkness. However, Luo Nan wasn't too far off in this regard. As mentioned before, the mica structure that he had designed was already quite high-end. It was tainted with Luo Nan's special trait of pure observation. Even in the abyss region, it was extremely difficult to discover and lock onto a target, and Luo Nan himself didn't build a solidified configuration in the abyss region. Right now, he was just improvising. He combined the general electromagnetic deployment method he had used before, the space-time structure fragment of his own sandwich domain, and a bit of the reverse interference effect of the condensation ring. He could adjust it at any time, twisting the storm turbulence of the abyss region to serve as a means of attack and defense. There was no point in being illuminated by the lighthouse. On the other hand, the blood-soul temple of the abyss region that he had temporarily borrowed had more or less revealed some traces. This wasn't a big problem. After all, it wasn't a frontal assault. What Luo Nan was facing right now wasn't the problem of being exposed or not. Instead, he was being suppressed to an extremely passive state while being illuminated by the lighthouse. The mental attack of the opponent was of the highest level that Luo Nan had ever seen. It rampaged through the abyss region like a tsunami. Although it didn't have a particularly top-notch explosive power, it was because it continued to operate at a high level. Its foundation was a destructive power that could crush the vast majority of enemies into powder. It was truly boundless, like a natural disaster. Was there no need for the other side to take a breather? It was truly explosive. At this time, Luo Nan really wanted to rush to the cockpit, grab Her Majesty Empress Wu by the collar, and ask, "What is a coward? Your Majesty, is there some sort of misunderstanding between your understanding of cowards and everyone else?" Before Luo Nan could put his thoughts into action, the opponent's attack suddenly retreated above the abyss region. Luo Nan finally let out a sigh of relief, but he couldn't help but be puzzled. Another half a minute, and his defensive line really wouldn't be able to hold. Retreating at this time, did he finally reach his limit? But it didn't seem like it. Although the opponent's tsunami-like mental attack had retreated, the lighthouse was still there. And at this time, the originally unbiased illumination mode had a slight change. Luo Nan could feel its subtle tendency towards the abyss region's blood-soul temple. To be more precise, it had an effect on the surroundings of the abyss region's blood-soul temple. Luo Nan pondered for a few seconds, and he suddenly came to a realization. The abyss region's blood-soul temple was probably borrowed. It was the most conspicuous and secondary location. In a certain sense, it was a bit like the evil eyes around the yacht, released for people to see. Did the other side suspect that this was a trap? This line of thought was measuring the heart of a gentleman with the yardstick of a villain. Luo Nan didn't know whether to laugh or cry for a time, but he suddenly understood the meaning behind Her Majesty Empress Wu's coward. In the end, Luo Nan couldn't help but turn his head to look at the cockpit behind him. He didn't rely on his eyes to capture the target anyway, and Her Majesty Empress Wu wouldn't give him a clear answer. On the other hand, Zhang Yingying had already appeared at the foremost position of the cockpit. She looked down through the glass curtain wall, appearing quite worried. Luo Nan smiled at her and made an okay gesture. His fingers had already returned to normal at this time. Since he had promised Her Majesty Empress Wu full authority to handle this matter, it would be shameful if he didn't handle this matter properly. He had to think of a way to deal with this. And his own experiment. It would be too sullen if they were interrupted by this sort of inexplicable enemy. Though Luo Nan said this, it really wasn't easy to handle. That bro was really a coward, but his strength was really hard. The attack just now was just a prelude. Right now, the intense conflicts in the surrounding sea region, including the Abyss region, continued to decrease. The pressure on Luo Nan was also decreasing, but this was by no means a carefree situation. Instead, it was like a tsunami that was about to arrive. First, the tide would abnormally ebb to expose the potholes of the seabed, accumulating an even more destructive force. The further he retreated now, the more violent the momentum would be in the future. The other side's next wave of attack had yet to truly arrive, but Luo Nan could already feel the endless storm of the Abyss region moaning on the verge of collapse. Chapter 999. It looked like he couldn't quite hold on. Luo Nan was no stranger to battles on the level of the Abyss region. He had a relatively accurate judgment of the situation. Actually, once one reached this level, the veil would be lifted on many things. The mysterious atmosphere would be completely gone. In the end, the attack and defense of the Abyss region were relatively simple at the current stage of Earth. The vast majority of battles relied on mobilizing the never-ending chaotic storm of the Abyss region, which came from nowhere, went nowhere, and formed impact damage. Whoever could build a more stable configuration in the Abyss region, give more efficient interference, and extract purer power would basically decide the outcome of the battle. Of course, upon reaching the extraordinary level, the structure would already be a domain. It could be solidified within the Abyss region, continuing to temper and nurture. The techniques and methods grasped would certainly be more numerous, and it would form a unique domain characteristic. Luo Nan's short fight with Constance, Monroe, and a few other mental-type extraordinary verified this point. Gong Qi's fleshly body was destroyed by Luo Nan's scheme. His solidified configuration in the Abyss region was the first to collapse. It was unknown how many of his trump cards were killed before he could use them. It could be said that Gong Qi died sullenly. From Luo Nan's perspective, President Ouyang's logic world and Luo Yuan's planar crossbow were truly superior in the Abyss region. The former had a strict structure and was practically flawless. The latter had the power of a domain that flew from beyond the heavens. They all gave off a feeling that they were unattainable. Compared to these powerful people who had already reached the top on Earth, Luo Nan had yet to confirm his solidified configuration in the Abyss region. The main reason was that he had the technique of pure observation. The interference effect of the Abyss region gave him a natural advantage over other ability users. He had more freedom to choose. Plus, his configuration design ability far exceeded his peers. He was more accustomed to improvising and seeking flexibility. There was another reason. Luo Nan had yet to find the path that suited him the most. This topic was a long one. There were also some subtle psychological factors. Putting these things aside for the time being, Luo Nan faced the tsunami-like momentum of the coward in front of him. Luo Nan was more or less regretful. He did not have a solidified configuration in the Abyss region that he could use freely. It was truly a headache at critical moments. This was because the contest between mental-type extraordinary could easily turn into an RTS game in a relatively long period of time. The process would be carried out according to the relevant process. Construct and expand the base, abyss region configuration. Gather and seize resources, control the turbulence. After that, it was scouting and eliminating the enemy. And if the first strike didn't work, then they would start to push the level of the army to a higher level, constantly creating difficulties for the enemy and creating conditions for themselves. They would continue to research and develop technology in an attempt to create even more powerful units in order to obtain an overwhelming advantage. For someone like him who didn't have a fixed configuration, it was the same as having to build a base from scratch. Technology, troops, and so on would always be one level behind. Of course, Luonan had his own advantages. His advantage was that he had cheat. Pure observation mode was equivalent to turning on a satellite hack. For him, the fog of war was as good as nothing. Even if the enemy was on full defense, he could roughly see the nature of the fog and choose a more targeted configuration to deal with it. This advantage in intelligence could often help him eliminate the disadvantages in the early stages, and it was even more effective in encounters. The problem was that in this battle, he was in a rather sorry state. Luonan wasn't too clear on whether or not his opponent had solidified his configuration in the chasm region. However, his opponent's ability to control the torrential storm of the chasm region was truly beyond imagination. Moreover, they didn't use any tricks, they just used a dignified formation to suppress him. Even though Luonan used the techniques he was used to in the past, he was still at a disadvantage in the face of this powerful and majestic power. But was this the difference in strength? Luonan was still a bit unconvinced. After all, what he had here was just a kite with the tattered soul cloak. He had no choice but to release it. It was a water vapor fake body. At best, it was a node that delivered energy. The mobilization of power was truly too much to handle. His opponent wasn't here with his real body, but looking at the tens of thousands of marine life gathered in the surrounding sea region, there were large amounts of parasitic dynamo cores. Their carriers on the material plane were quite impressive. On one side is a battery, and on the other side is an ultra-high voltage transmission line. There's no way to compare. Well, this was what Luonan had brought upon himself. He had chosen the difficulty level himself, so he had to grit his teeth and fight to the end. Luonan had given the coward the opportunity to fully display his abilities, so he had to swallow the bitter fruit that came with it. After this wave of attacks, he had to resist the next wave of even more terrifying tsunamis. The true tsunamis always had a direction. His opponent had utilized the complex environment of the chasm region to the greatest extent, hiding himself tightly. Luonan had some ideas regarding his opponent's position. Even though he didn't know his foundation, the outline elements outlined in his mind grew clearer and clearer after a few rounds of pondering. But in the end, his heart palpitated due to his opponent's intense reaction. For the time being, he didn't have any thoughts of drawing the psychic diagram. Everyone was still in a stalemate right now, and they were all using clones and long-range gestures. Overall, they were all under proper control. It seemed that Her Majesty Empress Wu had a bit of a friendship with the other side. Luonan didn't want to let the conflict intensify and inexplicably recruit another powerful enemy. But in this way, his options to break out of this predicament grew fewer and fewer. Less was good. Focus. Since he didn't have the leeway to choose, Luonan calmed down completely. During this window of time when the tsunami was about to arrive, he temporarily didn't care about the situation in the chasm region or the changes in the surrounding sea region. He just collected his mind and sensed his temporary body. Luonan earnestly sensed the water vapor that made up this body. He sensed the complex processes of disintegration, flow, exchange, and reconstruction under the impact of the violent winds and waves. He also casually verified a few structural patterns he obtained from dumb sand in the beach experiment. He waited until he felt that it was about time. Actually, it didn't even take a few seconds. His core telepathic thoughts suddenly soared high into the chasm region and connected with the Mother Mica configuration. His mind was entrusted to the Mother Mica. A large wave came crashing over in the next second. Luonan's body suddenly transformed into droplets of water and foam, collapsing and disappearing without a trace. The unforeseen event happened too quickly. Zhang Yingying, who was in the driver's seat, suddenly rushed forward a step. Her head and palm collided with the glass at the same time. Only then did she suddenly remember. The Luonan in front of her was simply condensed from water vapor. But what was she doing? It felt a lot smoother. In the end, Luonan couldn't compare to when the soul cloak was at its peak. The fake water vapor body projected over was no problem for him to deal with normal situations, but it would certainly be very difficult for him to deal with a psychic expert of the extraordinary level. Not to mention that he had to split his attention to other things. He had to leave a considerable portion of his mind with the Mother Mica. This would only pointlessly divide his limited energy. So Luonan made a prompt decision. He made a choice. He projected the soul strength of his avatar directly into the Mother Mica. He allowed this simple energy node to truly become a battery. It was no longer a separate structure. All it did was provide the Mother Mica with energy support, allowing the Mother Mica to use its own method to deal with the upcoming challenge. This could be considered as helping Luonan take a step further in his experiment. Luonan had never forgotten that his most important task right now was to verify the quality of the Mother Mica. He had to strive to reach a usable and referential level. Everything else had to be pushed back. Momentary success or failure didn't count for anything. Even if he was defeated by the coward in front of him, he only had an avatar here. He also had the support of Her Majesty Empress Wu. Would his life be in danger? Right now, he had to expose the problem. The more thoroughly he exposed it, the clearer the direction of his future adjustments would be. So Luonan's train of thought was set. The universal electromagnetic layout method, the blood-soul temple of the abyss region, the space-time configuration. All of it made way for the Mother Mica. He let this artifact, which was still extremely weak for the time being, possess miraculous qualities, face off against the coward over there. Well, of course, he wouldn't fight it head-on. Luonan didn't forget that the Mother Mica wasn't up to standard in terms of pure life energy intensity. It was impossible for it to face off against an extraordinary. If Luonan allowed the Mother Mica to accumulate energy and let the next tsunami shake the abyss region, breaking through all barriers, then there would be no need to compete. Luonan would immediately hug Her Majesty Empress Wu's thigh and cry for help. What Luonan did right now was to strike the Mother Mica midstream. As Luonan's train of thought became clear, an even greater amount of control threads were tossed out from the Mother Mica side, as if they were free. Yes, they were free. The only things consumed were energy and computing power, and Luonan could still support these for a period of time. A starving camel was still bigger than a horse. Even though Luonan's soul cloak was damaged, it had recovered over the past 2 days. In addition to the fact that they were on the ocean with abundant water vapor, the area it covered around the water vapor avatar exceeded the average standard of extraordinary. Luonan's senses were Mother Mica's senses. Right now, the area that the control threads spread out rapidly exploded from the few kilometers around the yacht to a diameter of nearly 100 kilometers. The depth of the control threads reached several kilometers into the deep water region. They practically stuck to the seabed as they swept past, and they continued to expand. They had already reached the level of flinging control threads at any living creature. Well, it wasn't that extravagant. The main goal was to target the coward over there and capture the target of its flesh and dynamo core's parasite. The first thing to do was to encircle it. Luonan had never been afraid of anyone when it came to the range of his mental senses and interference. This task only took 2 seconds of Mother Mica's time. Luonan received 100 times, 1,000 times more segmented information than before. This information involved all aspects of the flesh and dynamo core and its host. It was no small task to integrate and sort them out clearly. But this wasn't the most crucial thing. The most pressing problem placed before Luonan was to adapt to a new form. When all the information was absorbed and presented through the single channel of Mother Mica, the form of existence of this wave of information was clearly different from what Luonan had experienced in the past. Luonan was unable to see any form of flesh and organ structure within the visual information phenomenon. He couldn't even see the existence of too many substances. Most of the time, there were just ink-like shadows in the water, as well as faint fluorescent trails that flickered within the shadows. Chapter 1000. The shadows slowly unfurled, like fragmented wisps of smoke, drifting back and forth. The fluorescent light seemed to be broken and connected. It was like spider silk in the forest, faintly forming a net. Luonan didn't want to give these phenomena a so-called figurative analogy. This was because there was no comparison at all. If he were to switch to his original perspective, no matter how he cut it, the flesh would still be flesh and blood, and the organs would still be organs. There would just be a few more angles of view, a few more connections that were hard to see with the naked eye. He could use configuration theory to explain this. He absolutely wouldn't be like he was right now. He had practically completely shed away all familiar traces of concept. It was as if he had entered a world of another dimension. But this wasn't unexpected. After all, the structure of the existence of Mother Mica was as different as heaven and earth from the prior perceptual structure of humans. Humans' usual method of decoding external information was completely incompatible with Mother Mica. Therefore, Luonan's attention was focused on Mother Mica. It wasn't a simple tilt of his attention. Instead, it was the mutual translation of the two cognitive systems. It was the deep coupling of the two systems. Fortunately, there was a certain commonality between the two. For example, configuration. Right now, there was only configuration. Configuration could act as a translator between the two. Through this intermediate link, Luonan was able to guess a few things. The shadows he saw should be a large amount of sea creatures, yachts, oceans, atmosphere, and so on, as well as the aura, energy, and even soul strength radiating from them. Ordinary people, and even ability users, could see all things on the material and mental plane. They were nothing more than shadows and smoke in the background. Of course, there were a few details that differentiated them, but they weren't important. As for the fluorescent light that faintly formed a net, Luonan guessed that this should be the core connection structure of some sort of system. This could be explained using configuration theory or superconfiguration theory. But from the perspective of Mother Mica, Luonan could see the existence and direct results of the connections and effects. Luonan could faintly feel that what he had observed so far was only the tip of the iceberg of these fluorescent lines. There should be even more details in the deeper layers of visible fluorescent light. It was just that his current level of observation and segmentation wasn't quite enough. His understanding of Mother Mica's perspective and his proficiency in using it were lacking. He needed more time to adapt. When it came to adapting, there was nothing more effective than actual combat. At this moment, Mother Mica had basically trapped all of the hosts of the flesh dynamo cores that the cowards had sent to the surrounding seas. She had completely trapped them in an inescapable net set up by millions and millions of control wires. Not counting the ordinary marine creatures, there were about 6,000 to 7,000 aberrations. Among them, 5% and 0.5% of them had rank C and rank B life forms. According to the basic knowledge Luonan had learned about mutants, this number of mutants was more or less the limit of what the marine ecosphere with a radius of 2,000 to 3,000 kilometers could bear. Luonan thought that if the coward hadn't chased after Nyogue earlier, the surrounding sea region might not have been able to gather so many hosts. Nyogue was definitely going to be the scapegoat for today's troubles. However, this also meant that no matter how capable that coward was, it was impossible for him to mobilize more high-quality hosts to enter the deep-sea evil eye domain array in a short period of time. Luo Nan could be considered to have seen the peak of coward for a period of time. This could barely be considered a benefit. Since the inventory was complete and the numbers were clear, Luo Nan no longer had any reason to delay. At this moment, the subtle and close interaction between stupid sand and mica jellyfish during the experiment on the zeolite beach flashed in his consciousness again. The vast majority of the results had already become the projection technique of the control wires. However, there was still a portion, the part where the control wires interfered with stupid sand's physical grains of sand. Luo Nan never verified it again due to some considerations. Actually, this shouldn't be the case. After all, Mother Mica's reference object, the magnetic photon mica mother, didn't merely use soul magnetization to control Puppet. Mother Mica's terrifying ability included warping the plane of space and time, transcending worlds to summon powerful foreign species. It also included gluing and piecing together millions upon millions of different life substrates to form inconceivable warped creations. The powerful warping and reconstruction power of the material plane and life plane was perhaps closer to the core of Mother Mica's ability. In this aspect, Luo Nan's experiments were relatively conservative due to considerations of concealment and ethic. However, it couldn't be said that there weren't any at all. There was at least one area where Luo Nan hadn't disintegrated his water vapor body. Luo Nan had been referring to the interaction between stupid sand and Mother Mica all this time, allowing the water vapor body and Mother Mica to form a close connection. His efforts in this aspect allowed the water vapor body to smoothly fuse with Mother Mica. At the very least, the work of the battery wasn't bad. And right now, Luo Nan didn't just need to use this interference method for fusion. He also needed to walk in the direction of destruction. The reason why the coward on the other side was able to form a tsunami-like attack from such a great distance was absolutely because he relied on the frames erected by the hosts of the flesh and blood dynamo cores around him. Why did Luo Nan need to directly resist? Wouldn't it be over if he just flattened these frames? Could he? Of course he could. Right now, practically every strand of control wire was undergoing endless deep segmentation within the corresponding frame of the sea creature's body and soul. The strengths and weaknesses of each frame, as well as the state of the parasitic flesh and blood dynamo cores within these frames, all flowed through Mother Mica's perception system. Even though Mother Mica's observation perspective didn't possess the heart, brain, blood vessels, and other vital physiological points in the conventional sense, it didn't need to. Wouldn't it be fine if the system frame collapsed? This was what Luo Nan had designed. This was what he did. He was like a cautious researcher. He followed the principle of starting from easy to difficult, dividing into groups, and implementing strategies by classification. First, he experimented on an ordinary sea fish. Well, it wasn't difficult at all. At least, this was true from Mother Mica's point of view. The cluster of shadows that represented the sea fish had a pitifully weak fluorescent structure within it. It was directly torn apart, and then Luo Nan really didn't know what happened next. His experiments were done too thoroughly. He said that he was focused on Mother Mica, but he really didn't want to be distracted by anything else. He was limited by Mother Mica's special point of view, and he didn't have a concrete reference. He really couldn't figure out what the fate of the sea fish was after its original structure was destroyed. It should be dead, the control lines could still display their effects, but there was a marvelous feeling of sluggishness during the subsequent segmentation. It made the originally smooth segmentation become completely devoid of feeling. The shadowy portion of the visual field became even more fluffy. The fluorescent lines, which were originally weak to the point of being non-existent, were practically completely erased. Perhaps this state could be defined as the death of the manipulated target? The current Luo Nan couldn't be said to be a babbling baby learning how to speak. He was like a foreigner who held a dictionary and charged headlong into a new world where he didn't know the language. Actually, he was more like a pitiful worm who retained the memories of his previous life and reincarnated into the body of another species. He needed to match his new experiences bit by bit with the concepts of his previous life. Some could be done, but some couldn't be found no matter what. It was impossible to find an accurate matching point. Of course Luo Nan wasn't used to this, but his reason after learning and learning told him this was right. Back in the day, the school of fantasy had attempted to restore the magneto-optic mica. Luo Nan was unable to accurately judge just by relying on the version of the fantasy mimicry technique that Lieutenant Go Yi had imparted to him. But in this stage where the life stroma was already faintly budding, the school of fantasy still possessed a considerable amount of experience in the cultivation of other fantasy species. Luo Nan had brought out the basic principles of the school of fantasy. He had brainwashed Meng Chong, and he had given a lesson to all the ability users of the world. He had forced Meng Chong to experience the extreme state of the Hellfire Tyrant. The life stroma was determined by the life stroma, and it was driven by the instinctive desire to survive. Right now, Luo Nan had encountered such a situation, under this innate format which was completely different from ordinary perceptual modes. How did the mica exist? How did it sense? How did it leap from the life stroma level? What sort of desire and drive was produced? It wasn't too clear at the moment. The mica had cast millions and millions of control lines onto the marine life. Admittedly, there were some unique configurations bestowed with natural patterns, but Luo Nan's will still played a part in the casting itself. It couldn't be considered a driving force that sought survival. It was more like a mechanical propulsion mechanism that had been programmed. Therefore, there was still a long way to go. The more it was like this, the more he had to toss and turn with all his might. Luo Nan wasn't anxious. On the contrary, he was enjoying it. Wasn't the current experiment helping him quickly understand the scale delineation between life and death from the mica's point of view? After the experiment with normal sea fish was over, there were still normal parasitized sea fish. Then there were normal aberrations and normal parasitized parasite. There were also C rank, B rank. Layer by layer, they were compared. Oh, he nearly forgot. There was a coward glaring like a tiger watching its prey from the side. Luo Nan's experiment was done very quickly. The difficulty of the experiment wasn't high. With a few control groups, he had already dealt with over 100 targets under C rank. There weren't any twists and turns at all. He didn't even need to consider configurations or systems. He just needed to use the control lines to tear apart those fluorescent lines. It was so simple that it made Luo Nan feel a chill in his heart. In a certain sense, this was the embodiment of the difference between the mica and the life forms Luo Nan was familiar with in the past. There was a difference in levels. Frankly speaking, Luo Nan didn't feel too comfortable with such a discovery. Then Luo Nan felt that rather than doing this simple work, it would be better to aim at the flesh and blood dynamo core and directly make contact with it. It would be more challenging. Of course, it would be more meaningful for the experiment. Chapter 1001. From the perspective of Mother Mica, the existence of the flesh and blood dynamo core was actually more conspicuous than the vast majority of marine life. It was independent of the host's relatively stretched fluorescent structure. Its presence was stronger, like a nerve not existing on a neural network. Or a tumor. The kind that glowed. The special mode of existence of the flesh and blood dynamo core directly affected and even distorted the layout of light and shadow from the perspective of Mother Mica. And most importantly, a considerable portion of the flesh and blood dynamo core seemed to possess independence and could survive independently. Luo Nan had already noticed that even if he directly killed the host and destroyed the visible fluorescent structure, a considerable portion of the nodules were able to withdraw in time after destroying the host's system of existence. They wandered in the vaster shadow of life, seeking another cluster of fluorescent structure to bond and parasitize the host again. Well, Luonan was able to find a relatively familiar sense of space and time when placed from this point of view. Moreover, he naturally broke away from the limitations of a living individual and placed his gaze into a dimension that was completely constructed from shadows and light. In this way, the individual faded away and the entirety became prominent. Luonan was able to clearly perceive the overall structure of the array that the opponent had built upon the foundation of the flesh and blood dynamo core. Speaking of which, wasn't the efficiency of a single kill too low? If he were to start from the structure as a whole. Luonan's thoughts stirred and the entire layout of light and shadow under his clairvoyance suddenly shook. The shadow of smoke and ink separated and reunited irregularly. The fluorescent lines clearly trembled, driving the tens of thousands of nodules within the large net. It was like a colorful lantern being blown by the wind. It was extremely beautiful. However, this dazzling scene wasn't just the result of Luonan's interference. There was also the terrifying power of the coward that was pressing closer. Oh my, this person has finally entered the fray. It was just a joke. Luonan had nearly forgotten about this person. The opponent could really hold back. He had already established an absolute advantage in the Abyss region, but he still hadn't arrived. Actually, it was only a few dozen seconds. But on the level of extraordinary, a few dozen seconds was enough for many people to die 100 times over. Of course, Luonan could faintly understand some of the factors. When he gave up the fake body of water vapor and merged with Mother Mica, he decisively abandoned all the attack and defense structures in the Abyss area. Even the Bloody Soul Temple in the Abyss area was hidden again. Plus the high invisibility of Mother Mica, that dude probably couldn't find the target anymore. In such a situation, as a coward, that Her Majesty Empress Wu had labeled, what would the other side think? What to do? If that fellow turned around and directly attacked the yacht, Luonan would absolutely not sit idly by, regardless of whether or not Her Majesty Empress Wu was on board. But the problem was that there weren't any. That person controlled the torrential storm in the Abyss area with an astonishing level of control, causing it to hang in the air but not fall, pouring down but not falling. Yet, he was hesitating over there. In the past, Luonan always felt that he was overthinking things sometimes. But this person, even if she was intimidated by Her Majesty Empress Wu, was acting a bit too hesitant. So much so that Luonan suspected that if he hadn't experimented with the hosts of the fleshly dynamo cores and more or less indicated the direction, that coward would still be able to persevere like this. In any case, the rapid disappearance of the hosts of the fleshly dynamo cores had subtly exceeded the natural reduction rate of the chaotic bloody situation in the sea. And Luonan's deliberate targeting of the fleshly dynamo cores finally aroused the vigilance of that person. No matter how deeply Mother Mica was hidden, there would always be traces once it interfered with the material plane. The coward's accomplishments in the mental side didn't need to be mentioned. He quickly followed the traces. In the beginning, he wanted to directly grab the interference trajectory of the control thread and trace it back to the Abyss area. He wanted to grab Luonan's weak point in one fell swoop. However, even Luonan himself had to carefully ponder over the interference mode of Mother Mica. How could the coward chase after him in a hurry? After crossing paths a few times in the void, the other side knew that it wouldn't work. He quickly changed his train of thought. He only maintained pressure in the Abyss area and began to pour more power into the various locations of the fleshly dynamo cores. He adopted a posture of waiting for the rabbit to come to him. I know you're coming. I'll give it to you. The other side grasped the main point. It was impossible for Luonan to avoid it at this time. He held an eager heart as he made further contact with the numerous luminous nodes under the Mother Mica's light and shadow perspective. This was a true collision. There was no room for buffer. This also represented that the RTS game in the Abyss area had sunk into the material plane. To be more precise, this was a battle for resources. The two warring sides were involved in every domain. In this level of conflict, Luonan actually held the initiative. This was because he was the one who chose the method of impact. This naturally led to the result of the impact. The collision between the two sides completely erupted from the start. The shaking affected the entire situation. Moreover, the range of influence and penetration on the system level made the impact more intense. The target bearing the impact became more fragile. From the Mother Mica's perspective, at least several hundred to nearly 1,000 fluorescent threads that represented the connection of life systems collapsed at the same time. The feeling of collapse was crisp, the range of connection was wide, and the speed at which they were transmitted to each other was fast. Even Luonan, who had already gone through several rounds of experimentation, was caught unprepared. So much so that he spent at least half of his energy forcefully tossing and turning to create a safe zone or isolation zone. He placed it horizontally around the yacht to prevent the aftermath of the impact from truly affecting Zhang Yingying and the others. Well, this was a stress reaction. It might not be necessary. This was because even with the Mother Mica's relatively chaotic observation method, it was easy to recognize that a certain region in the shadow should belong to Her Majesty Empress Wu's unique form of existence. There were a dozen bright and resplendent stars in the depths of the heavy shadow. They looked like a rapidly evolving star chart. They possessed their own orbit, and they radiated brilliant rays of light in all directions. They locked down an extremely stable shadow region. They basically encircled the yacht within. This was a bit like the result of Luonan's observation of the living starry sky, but it was more complex and nimble. It formed its own layout. Luonan could vaguely see that there were fluorescent lines between the dozen or so stars. However, the radiance of the stars was far too dazzling, and their orbit was far too complex. It was to the extent that the lines were blurry and ever-changing. It was hard to observe them a step further. Let's not talk about trying things out for now. It was just that Luonan didn't know if this phenomenon was possessed by all extraordinaries, or if it was exclusive to Her Majesty Empress Wu. Luonan divided his attention here for a moment, but he soon gathered it back together. He returned to the conflict and the experiment itself. The effects of the shaking continued in other areas outside of the yacht. Having lost the layer of restriction of fluorescent lines, the shadow region, which could represent all of humanity's perceptible objects, shook off even more loosely. It was to the point that the outlines of some individuals that could be barely seen and guessed became blurry and faded. It was as if all forms of existence were erased. Luonan didn't have the energy to think about the corresponding scene in reality for the time being. He could only confirm that when the shadow was stirred into even finer pieces, there were a few dozen or even 100 luminous nodes that couldn't avoid being instantly unhooked. They scattered in all directions. However, these luminous bodies, which represented the flesh and blood dynamo core, had an extremely strong existence. Even under these circumstances, the vast majority of them still maintained their integrity. They wandered within the diffused shadow, attempting to carry out a new parasitic cycle. Of course, the parasitic cycle from Mica's perspective didn't involve grabbing a piece of the shadow region and forcefully stuffing it in. Instead, Luonan had to hook onto the fluorescent lines that barely existed amidst the shaking and merge them into his new life system. This was by no means easy, and it caused a corner of the coward's long-range interference array to suddenly sink into chaos. That side clearly didn't catch Luonan's method of exerting force in time, so the efficiency of their response was quite low. Even though they didn't receive any damage, they still had to sort out the order of the array once more. They were still a bit flustered for a time. Luonan's first wave of attacks occupied an advantage, but it was just a surprise. The actual results of the battle weren't that great. However, the swimming and churning of the luminous nodes stimulated even more details. It also helped Luo Nan's increasingly mutated senses to touch upon even more and more complex details. Luo Nan faintly captured a sort of seemingly familiar rubbing effect within the surrounding environment of violent shaking. It could collapse at any time, and it could reform at any time. This kind of rubbing happened between the shadows of mind and matter, between two fluorescent systems that were originally unrelated. Gradually, it crossed the barriers and boundaries that humans were accustomed to, such as each other, virtual and real, body and soul, and so on. The originally simple connection suddenly became hundreds, thousands, and tens of thousands of times more complicated, forming an interaction that crossed multiple levels and dimensions at the same time. From a human's perspective of observation and thought, if one wanted to clearly understand the nature of this effect, which was exponentially increasing in complexity every second, one could practically spiral to the heavens on the spot. But from Micah's unique simplified perspective, this was nothing more than the splitting and merging of the shadows of the dark clouds and the collision and friction of the fluorescent framework. Although it was complex, it was still an observable object. More importantly, when the complexity of this series of changes reached a certain degree, the rubbing effect became even more abundant. Marvelous sparks burst forth from within. At first, they flickered in an instant, rising and falling in an unpredictable manner. Later on, they became wisps and wisps, faintly discernible. Later on, these sparks began to chase each other back and forth, interfering and colliding with each other. They wandered between the shadows and fluorescent light. Most of the time, they could only exist for an extremely short period of time. But even the blink of an eye was enough to produce a clear effect on the surrounding structure of light and shadow. The luminous nodes of the fleshly dynamo core could also form an effect on the surroundings. But when the two were compared, there was no comparison. Wherever these sparks appeared, the shadows that had just dispersed and the ruptured fluorescent light would seem to have fallen into a powerful force field. They would be forcibly and haphazardly twisted and pieced together. But soon, they would collapse and scatter once again due to improper operation. This made the chaotic situation even more chaotic. Luo Nan didn't care how the chaos intensified. He just went to make logical deductions. Magnetolite? Chapter 1002. That's right. This was the magnetic light that Luo Nan had tried to capture and trace, but he had failed time and time again. It occurred outside of the main skeleton of the mica, but it was within the domain controlled by the control lines. There wasn't much difference between the two. This was because these little things existed for a short period of time. They quickly captured the most stable interference channels within the surrounding structures and quickly formed a connection. In this way, the magnetic light continued to grow in scale. It passed through the control lines in a form close to a pulse, and it was channeled into the main body of the mica. Luo Nan was still repeating his thoughts from not too long ago. Perhaps this is the magnetic light of the magnetic light of the magnetic light mica. While his thoughts were still undulating, a new force occurred within the water vapor skeleton of the mica. The one affected was now Luo Nan himself. This time, it was impossible to say whether Luo Nan had captured the magnetic light, or whether the magnetic light had stuck to him, or whether the magnetic light had already deeply fused with the mica and transmitted it to him as a feedback of perception. Oh, something didn't seem right? It was due to the marvelous force of the magnetic light that Luo Nan suddenly discovered that the two systems of the mica and the fake body, which he thought had already fused together, were actually separated from each other on a deeper level, even though they both belonged to the structure of water vapor. Their physical properties were already indistinguishable from each other. As for what it was no longer important. In the instant the magnetic light force appeared, that faintly discernible barrier was simply annihilated. The two systems were completely connected together. Luo Nan's thoughts suddenly became absent-minded. Then he discovered that the structure that had previously acted as a battery for the mica, the only function that the fake body of water vapor still had already been cleanly dissociated. Or it could be said that it had been absorbed cleanly by the structure of the mica. Right now, only a few core things remained. It was the imprint of Luo Nan's consciousness. It floated within the structure of the mica, about to fuse or not. This sort of change didn't harm Luo Nan. It was just baffling. Just as he was feeling baffled, this bit of imprint of consciousness suddenly stirred. It collided with something and instantly fused with it. His consciousness was still there, but it seemed to be wrapped in a layer of shell. It just moved in this way in the void. To be more precise, it was moving irregularly within the structure of the mica. What was going on? It was as if I had been fused into the magnetic light? To put it more precisely, the greatest possibility was that the imprint of Luo Nan's consciousness that Luo Nan left in this world was not Mother Cloud. Instead, it was fused together with the magnetic light that Mother Cloud used to transform into. Before Luo Nan could figure out the logic behind this, a new perceptual change appeared. Luo Nan's soul cloak, the great production line of the living starry sky, the altar spiderweb, and other traditional energy and information supply channels clearly became estranged. One must know that this was the most important source of sustenance for the mica mother. The supply is still being provided, and the effectiveness is still effective, but it feels a little like scratching an itch through the boot. The bionic life structure of Mother Mica was clearly continuing to grow steadily, and its aura was growing more and more exuberant. But for some reason Luo Nan, very hungry, and he was getting hungrier and hungrier. What's going on? Stir-fry vegetables and make soup? In the cockpit of the yacht, Zhang Yingying's forehead was pressed against the glass, almost melting the surface, but at the same time, her fingertips were a little cold. Her mouth spoke in a relaxed manner, but her heart was twitching a bit abnormally. This was a natural physiological reaction to a few extremely stimulating situations. It was unknown when it started, but the surrounding waters of the yacht entered an extremely desperate and treacherous situation. It was hard for Zhang Yingying to accurately describe the situation. It was as if there was a layer of glass separating her from the chaos of the sea. There was an insurmountable barrier between her thoughts and the internal logic of the events before her eyes. Who could see two fishes that had gone out of control and collided with each other, sticking together? In that instant, their bodies, flesh, and blood completely lost their original nature. It was as if they were wax that had been melted, condensing into the most random shape upon meeting the cold. Such a scene was not an exception. Instead, it was happening in the waters surrounding the yacht. Zhang Yingying could see it happening every moment. There was no need for any collisions. The seemingly vigorous sea creatures that could rampage up and down the waves as they pleased inexplicably had their entire bodies collapse. It wasn't being torn apart, it wasn't being crushed, it wasn't exploding, it wasn't being burned, and so on. It was the complete collapse of the structure of their flesh and blood in an instant. Moreover, there was no trace of a strong external force. You couldn't say that it was the wind and waves on the sea that caused this, right? There were only vaguely visible conduction trajectories, like a terrible virus that broke out in a certain area and then spread rapidly at a terrible speed and intensity. In the steering cabin, the cabin wall blocked the view, and she couldn't see the panoramic view of the surrounding waters. She didn't know how far this terrible scene would spread before it ended. But she could see that at this time, in addition to the foam of the waves, the dregs and slurry of the flesh and blood were also swept up by the strong wind and huge waves. The bloody waves hit the yacht. Zhang Yingying felt that the damage was much higher than the previous battleship slicing sword. In fact, there were a lot of indescribable debris stuck to the windshield of the steering cabin. Then, it was swept away by the wind and waves, stuck to it again, and swept away again. The cycle repeated itself. Zhang Yingying adjusted herself and felt that her breathing had become shallow. Even so, there was still some fishy smell lingering at the tip of her nose. She knew that it was an illusion, but she still felt it. Who in the world is that? A devil? Zhang Yingying didn't have a clear target for conversation. She just vented her emotions. She never expected Her Majesty Empress Wu, who was steering the helm, to respond in the first instant. Yeah. You can ask later. Zhang Yingying blinked her eyes. She kept feeling that her boss's words had a hidden meaning. But she couldn't think too much about it right now. The battle situation in the surrounding waters far exceeded the scope of her understanding. She was even more worried. Luonan's water vapor body had disappeared. How was he going to fight against that so-called coward? How did such a hellish situation occur? I'll go out and take a look. Zhang Yingying really couldn't hold back. She leaped to the door of the steering cabin in 2 or 3 steps, but she hesitated for a moment. The out-of-control scene outside had an intense dissuading effect. But in the end, she gritted her teeth, opened the door, and went out. Meng Chong nodded toward Her Majesty Empress Wu and followed behind without a sound. Right now, Zhang Yingying really didn't have the courage to run to the front deck. She simply went to the top deck and stood at the highest point. This was also the position furthest away from the bloody wave. She raised her eyes and looked into the distance. She still couldn't see Luonan's figure between the sea and the sky. However, the dark clouds gathered together, and the winds and waves were high. They stirred the blood and flesh that rose and fell on the surface of the sea, rushing back and forth. They still possessed the destructive power to capsize the yacht at any time. Zhang Yingying didn't know how much of this was the power of nature, and how much of it was the clash of power between two extraordinaries. She just felt that she was standing at a relatively high place. She raised her eyes and saw a contradiction that made her feel uncomfortable. It was intense and sinister. It was berserk and ice-cold. It was as if there were incorporeal ghosts roaming and laughing on the surface of the sea. Perhaps it was because of this that the sea creatures in the surrounding waters, which had been fighting over food with each other not too long ago, began to dive frantically. It didn't matter if they lived in the layer of seawater or not. They all wanted to drill down, all for the sake of avoiding the virus in the atmosphere and within the remains of flesh and blood on the surface of the sea. But was it truly effective? The more Zhang Yingying thought, the more she couldn't find an answer. Instead, it burned her brain. Perhaps it was because of this that breathing became a bit difficult. Honestly speaking, after her field of vision was broadened, the situation in the surrounding waters became more vivid. The sense of crisis that followed grew stronger. So much so that she felt a bit regretful. Her legs felt a bit weak. She unconsciously emitted a brilliant spiritual light, making the white rainbow in her body activate its defensive mode. If the oncoming sea winds and waves really did carry a virus or something, that would be too hard to accept. At this moment, the familiar rhythm of footsteps entered her ears. Zhang Yingying turned her head in surprise. She saw a figure turn around at the entrance of the deck. It was Her Majesty Empress Wu, who had been staying in the cockpit all this time. "Boss!" Her Majesty Empress Wu slightly narrowed her eyes. She welcomed the oncoming gale and the damp, bloody air. She seemed to be sniffing something. Her expression was vivid, but it was hard to tell whether she liked or disliked it. 2 seconds later, Her Majesty Empress Wu turned her face. "If you're really afraid, then go back to the cabin." "I'm afraid?" Just a little bit. Besides, you're here, boss." Seeing Her Majesty Empress Wu, Zhang Yingying's mind immediately calmed down. Her mouth also began to become nimble. What was even more nimble than her mouth was her actions. Zhang Yingying directly ran to Her Majesty Empress Wu's side and tightly hugged the crook of her arm. "Boss, that guy is too much. He knows you're here, but he still made such a scene." Her Majesty Empress Wu only smiled. "He's indeed too much, but he can't do it for long. A battle between transcendents. They're having fun killing here, but T-City can't take it anymore. The fighter plane just took off, and it won't take long to get here." Zhang Yingying blurted out, "Did he come here to die?" "It's all right. The pilot is quite durable. Obviously, the pilot that Her Majesty Empress Wu mentioned was definitely not an ordinary person. He was most likely an extraordinaire. As Zhang Yingying was thinking, she heard her boss ask, "You really don't want to go back? With that guy's clumsy control skills, it's fine if he gets a few fish scales on your face. But what if it's tentacles, sarcomas, sharp teeth, or something? That's not good." What? Zhang Yingying finally came back to her senses. She didn't know when it started, but everyone's target had been mistaken? But before Zhang Yingying could find the rational clues she should have from her disbelief, a wave of reverberations suddenly rang out beside her ear. It sounded like a strange snoring sound, as if someone was choking on water. There were also muffled sounds of mooing and splashing sounds. There was no sense of hierarchy, and it was just a flurry of struggling. Zhang Yingying very naturally shifted her gaze to look and saw that there was an explosion of water on the side of the ship. A certain strange existence with half of its huge bull body jumped out of the sea. It crazily waved its spider-like limbs at the yacht. It didn't seem to realize that its body was still covered in a layer of blood and minced meat. Looking at it, it didn't need to think to know that it was calling for help. Did he knock himself out of his mind? Chapter 1003. Zhang Yingying had a strange feeling when she faced the instigator of the trouble at sea. Could it be that this bro had forgotten who was the one who had attacked it just now? Speaking of which, the reason it was still alive and kicking was probably because of its iron head. It didn't seem to be a problem with its head. Zhang Yingying quickly noticed that the bull demon's chest and abdomen were already the most eye-catching. Now, in the night, it was even more eye-catching. The dark green fluorescence was originally rather dark, and the dizziness was rather serious. But now, it was fluctuating violently, as if it was boiling. Perhaps it was even showing signs of vaporization? Zhang Yingying was just letting her imagination run wild. But visually, the bull demon's big belly was indeed swelling up. The extent of the swelling could be seen, as if it could explode at any moment. Perhaps this was the reason for the bull demon's cry for help. This fellow seemed to be in so much pain that he quickly lost his patience. After struggling for a while, he threw caution to the wind and jumped onto the yacht under Her Majesty Empress Wu's gaze. From the looks of it, it was about to fly directly to the top deck. Wow! Zhang Yingying let out a soft cry. But as expected, there was another muffled sound. An invisible wall appeared out of nowhere in the atmosphere, blocking the bull demon's head. The fellow had only jumped a few meters before it crashed into the wall. With a miserable groan, it fell back down. But perhaps it was just luck? A huge wave rolled over, and the sea instantly rose by 3 to 5 meters. This caused the angle of its falling body to change, and it actually crashed into the railing on the side of the lower deck before it flipped over. The huge belly even acted as a buffer, helping it bounce a few times on the deck, railing, and bulkhead. In the end, it fell flat on its back, to the point that the dark green fluorescence within it seemed like it was about to seep out. She was really worried that it would explode just like that. But no matter what, the bull demon had still safely boarded the yacht. This alone made it much luckier than the other creatures in the surrounding waters. Based on what Zhang Yingying could barely sense with her own mental senses, the marine creatures, be they ordinary shoals of fish or mutated species, were mostly unable to escape misfortune even if they hid under the surface of the sea. For many creatures, even though they had dived to a depth of dozens of meters, they still couldn't avoid the experience. The air, the seawater, and the marine creatures themselves were cooperating to create blood-curdling flowers of flesh and blood, which were blossoming at various depths of the ocean one wave after another. Some twisted flesh and blood even floated to the surface of the sea, merging with other similar existences along the way, as if trying to nurture something in this terrifying flower. But in the end, it still collapsed. At the very least, with the passage of time, the signs of life in the sea areas that the yacht passed through were quickly decreasing. How long had it been? The surroundings had already turned from a noisy uproar to dead silence. The evil eyes, that had covered the surface of the sea earlier, were long gone. Looking up, the night sky, the dark wind, the dark waves, and the filth filled everything. But even more than that, there was the destructive power that created all of this, dominating everything on a level that no one could understand. Zhang Yingying was a little absent-minded. She subconsciously hugged her boss's arm tighter, forgetting to ask how they should deal with that lucky bull ghost. At this moment, Meng Chong, who had been silent all this time, suddenly spoke up. "Something is coming up." Where? "The bottom of the yacht is. Climbing upwards." Meng Chong hesitated for a moment before he found a relatively accurate verb to describe it. Zhang Yingying's spiritual sensing range was mainly for highly threatening targets and living things, similar to dynamic vision. Her other areas were more ordinary. Even if she was reminded, she could only vaguely sense it, and the angle of the bottom of the yacht was rather awkward. She couldn't see it if she tilted her head. But this wasn't a problem for Zhang Yingying. She simply released the floating camera and let this little thing fly down to extend her vision. A second later, Zhang Yingying regretted it. Because with the outstanding night vision of the floating camera, she could clearly see that there was actually a layer of membrane formed from blood and flesh. It spread all the way up the bottom of the yacht, as if it wanted to completely wrap up the high-speed hull and swallow it in one fell swoop. This layer of flesh and blood, which was still flowing with blood and flesh juice, was definitely pieced together from the broken remains of countless sea creatures. But what kind of monster would they be pieced together? "Boss." Zhang Yingying's voice was a little out of tune. Her Majesty Empress Wu patted the back of her hand. "What are you afraid of? It's not like it's targeting us." "Then who is it targeting?" Her Majesty Empress Wu smiled. There was already no need to answer. Roars came from below. The bull ghost, who had just caught its breath on the lower deck, felt as if its back was on fire. It began to crazily move its limbs again, hoping to adjust its posture so that it could climb to the upper deck of the yacht again. But at this time, its body, which had been as light as a feather, was completely dragged down by its bloated belly. It struggled to get up with its 8 legs facing the sky. But the membrane of flesh and blood was advancing at an astonishing speed. In a few breaths, it had quickly crept over the railing of the yacht, stuck to the lower deck, and approached the bull ghost. Zhang Yingying's eyelids twitched a few times. She watched the membrane of flesh and blood of an indescribable color start to swell and extend. It felt like an amoeba that had been magnified billions of times. It kept changing its shape, extending pseudopodia, and formed an encirclement structure to hunt. Its prey was undoubtedly the bull ghost. Seeing that it couldn't escape, the bull ghost actually let out a scream that sounded like a human's, but what use was it? Before the scream ended, it had already been stuck to the part of the membrane of flesh and blood that had extended out. First, it was its 2 limbs, then its back, before it was completely wrapped up. It was like a fat spider that had been tangled to death by a spider's web. It looked absurd and desperate. The membrane of flesh and blood was so powerful that the bull ghost's entire body was constricted and deformed. It seemed like it could explode at any time and then melt its broken limbs and flesh inside. Her Majesty Empress Wu still had no intention of intervening. Zhang Yingying felt that she was really going to have a nightmare tonight. Before she could let her imagination run wild, on the lower deck, a ghostly fluorescence suddenly increased in brightness. It instantly broke through the bull ghost's flesh and even the obstruction of the membrane of flesh and blood, and blossomed in the void. It exploded. Zhang Yingying subconsciously narrowed her eyes, but she couldn't help but look. Fortunately, she did, because what happened next was completely different from what she had imagined. After the cluster of ghostly green fluorescence really broke through the obstruction of the flesh and blood, the severe dizziness from before was greatly alleviated. It was so much so that people on the upper deck could already see that the fluorescence itself was actually highly differentiated. It seemed like countless fireflies had gathered in one place. It was just that it lacked intelligence, and overall it was rather orderly. Most importantly, the spots of fluorescence were even extending in both directions, stretching out into even finer lines. One end continued to expand and differentiate, while the other end continued to gather and shrink. At first glance, it looked like a forest that had been invisible before but was now gradually disappearing. The branches and leaves were luxuriant, but the main trunk wasn't very obvious. It was completely hidden among the branches and leaves that were constantly branching off. Or perhaps the lower half, including the root system, was still hidden behind the void. Because of such a change, the membrane of flesh and blood that was closing in was more or less distracted. Some of them even began to melt by themselves, or was it trying to reshape it into a more suitable structure? In any case, the misfortune of the bull ghost exploding and dying was somewhat delayed, but the screams became even louder. What on earth is this thing? Zhang Yingying felt that her memory had been offended. It looks a little familiar. No, I don't think I've seen this thing before. But who have I heard of it before? She turned her gaze to Her Majesty Empress Wu, but unexpectedly, a voice came from behind her. Mr. Luo mentioned it before. It's a plant type. Meng Chong's response caught Zhang Yingying off guard. Meng Chong was very confident. At the end of last year, when Mr. Luo and the Order of Justice's secret-bound high priest, Li Taixing, met, he raised this extremely sharp conclusion. At that time, he compared the Ring of Blood and Will to the Order of Justice's Scales of Truth system. He said that the former was a tool type that was shaped like the abyss, while the Order of Justice's system was like a large tree that was planted in the abyss, but its roots continued to extend downwards. It was a biological type or plant type. Ah, I have an impression when you say this. Cloud City Water Village, right? Was it before or after Sister Moya's concert? As her memories flowed back, Zhang Yingying was truly shocked. Do you have to be so exaggerated? I was there at that time, but I don't remember it as clearly as you do. Matters that have nothing to do with us become chaotic. Meng Chong bowed slightly to hide his somewhat bitter smile. Mr. Luo's comparison of tool type and plant type hit quite a few secret orders' sore spots. As for the matter of Lady Halder and Yin Lu being remotely monitored through a puppet, there was no need to mention it. Zhang Yingying chuckled. He just loves to do these kinds of jobs that destroy people's bowls. Oh, according to what you're saying, this boss Niu Gui is an important member of some secret order? Perhaps not just that. Judging from Niu Gui's current state, he looks quite familiar to me. Meng Chong made a rare self-mocking remark. He explained further, this thicket is somewhat like the embryonic form of the abyss's solidified configuration. It also seems like a carrier for the Order's sacrificial vessel. But no matter what, this is definitely the crystallization of some belief system. It is the result of many years of accumulated faith. Through it, the core information of an order, including the characteristics of their faith, their fundamental techniques, their various levels of believers, all of it will be exposed without a doubt. The premise is that they must be able to perfectly break through and resist the backlash. Take my order as an example. This kind of crystallization isn't unique, but there is only one backup. If it is damaged or lost, it will truly be a serious injury to the bones. It will greatly damage our vitality. Of course, these are just the special characteristics of our idealistic order. As for the divine order, I don't dare to speak carelessly. Meng Chong thought of the human-faced arachnid's human-faced arachnid when he said these words. The embryonic sacrificial vessel and the shepherd's imprint were lost in Xia City. He also thought of Elder Mo Lun, of course. This also included Luonan. There were some matters that really couldn't withstand pondering, but the passage of time made pondering over them meaningless. Zhang Yingying didn't know how complicated Meng Chong's state of mind was. She discussed the matter as it stood and immediately gave Niu Gui the final verdict. I've finally figured it out. Why was this brother able to attract so much trouble? She blinked her eyes as she spoke to this point. She turned around and sent a flattering smile. Boss, can you give me some guidance? Chapter 1004. Her Majesty Empress Wu's gaze did not move in the direction of the Nyogui or the fluorescent trees, at all. Instead, it was cast towards the dark, distant sea. It wasn't until Zhang Yingying began to shake her arm that she raised the corner of her lips slightly. I have no opinion on other people's trophies. It's just that if we want to snatch it completely, we might still have a chance. Don't be so cold. Why did Zhang Yingying want Her Majesty Empress Wu to open her mouth? Wasn't it because she wanted to take the opportunity to have Her Majesty Empress Wu intervene and quickly end this crazy battle? However, just as she was about to use the power of the 12th layer of the great art of acting spoiled, her heart suddenly tightened. Relying on her own mental sensing ability, Zhang Yingying couldn't sense too many details. She could only vaguely sense that the dual pressure that came from the material and mental planes had somehow turned into some kind of highly concentrated jet stream that suddenly streaked past her. Dangerous, extremely dangerous. The jet stream that streaked past was actually more like a long whip lashing through the void. It didn't really hit anyone, but just the loud whip flower and the whistling impact it brought could make people feel the heavy destructive power. In the frame of body and soul, the white rainbow hummed softly in response, but it was much slower. If he really wanted to target her, he would probably be dead by now. Zhang Yingying couldn't help but shiver. There was no doubt that this was a threat. For a moment, she thought that she had become a hostage. But she was aware of it. However, when he thought about Her Majesty Empress Wu beside him, he felt that it was unlikely. Zhang Yingying turned to look at her boss, but the latter had no intention of comforting her. As a matter of fact, Zhang Yingying couldn't help but follow his line of sight and look up at the sky. Only then did she realize that the dark clouds in the sky, which were almost pressing down on the surface of the sea, had unknowingly revealed a long, deep crack. The crack extended for an unknown distance, as if the entire sky had been torn in half. The trail of the long scar was right above her head. Zhang Yingying was in a daze for a moment before she realized that the long scar that tore through the clouds was parallel to the current route of the yacht. It could be seen that the clouds on both sides were surging violently, but no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't cover up this scar. With a few more glances, one could vaguely see the purer sky above the clouds. Did he have the strength but nowhere to use it? Zhang Yingying couldn't help but complain. She didn't even need to think to know that this kind of tyrannical impact, which was highly threatening to the passengers on the yacht, was definitely the enemy's method. A threat was a threat. At the very least, this kind of method was clearly understood. The flower of flesh and blood feast in the surrounding waters really left people speechless. Found you. The strong will crosses the entire sea surface, interrupting Zhang Yingying's wild imagination. It also puts a lot of pressure on her. Every will that has taken shape here is like the heat flow from the eruption of a volcano in the sea. It is so ferocious that a few muffled thunders explode in the atmosphere, shaking people's lips a little numb. The bulkheads of the yacht produced a very clear resonance effect, so much so that the entire hull seemed to be humming. There were already very few creatures on the surface of the sea, and all of them were shivering in the deeper waters. If Her Majesty Empress Wu wasn't by her side, Zhang Yingying felt that she wouldn't be any better. Speaking of which, these words sounded fierce, but in most movies and television works, weren't these flags raised by the great villains? Oh my, I've been discovered by you. Hee, this line wasn't anything good. In any case, the air fluctuated slightly as the familiar will and voice rang out. Luonan, who had disappeared for a long time, reappeared. It was unknown where he came from, but he finally appeared on the lower deck next to Niu Gui, who had already been wrapped in a film of flesh and blood. It looked like Luonan didn't look any different from before. He even turned half his body to greet the three people on the top deck. Zhang Yingying gave him a middle finger in response without a trace of politeness. This was especially true when she saw that the film of flesh and blood, which nearly covered the entire lower deck, didn't react at all when faced with the new target. The film even slowly shrank back. She felt more and more that this middle finger could be jabbed a few more times. Niu Gui's screams became even more miserable. At this time, Luonan was on the surface of the sea outside of the deck, roughly 50 meters away from the yacht. The pitch-black waves suddenly rose up, forming a rough mold in a state that severely violated the laws of nature. Enormous amounts of seawater rose up high and flowed down. It was independent of the natural form of the ocean, forming a waterfall wall. Or perhaps it was a screen or a relief sculpture. The seawater on the wall was still in the form of seawater. It flowed endlessly, and it even formed an exchange with the scouring waves, forming lines and silhouettes that were constantly changing. It looked like everything, yet it didn't look like anything. Perhaps it's because there's a glowing, evil eye embedded in the wall. It's not in line with the human aesthetic standards? The waterfall wall continued to flow along with the surging seawater. It wasn't any slower than the high-speed yacht, and it looked extremely smooth. Strictly speaking, after Her Majesty Empress Wu let go, the yacht's smoothness as it passed through the waves could no longer compare to this waterfall wall. In short, this was certainly the carrier of some formidable power. It belonged to the coward that Her Majesty Empress Wu spoke of. It was an extraordinary so powerful that it made one's liver tremble. The purpose of its appearance didn't seem to be to strut around, but to attempt to communicate with Luonan. The telepathic thought that spanned across the void was as tyrannical as before, but it had a source. It was emitted from the waterfall wall. This had no meaning in terms of efficiency, but perhaps it was a form of face-to-face respect? This respect was even reflected in the basic expression, "Give it to me and we'll be friends." The image of the so-called it appeared on the waterfall wall at the same time the telepathic thought was delivered. It was like a master artisan relief sculpture that struggled to break out of the wall. It had the head of a cow and the body of a spider. It was none other than the cow ghost. Luonan didn't say anything, but Zhang Yingying secretly rolled her eyes. She wasn't sure about anything else, but one thing was clear. There was a problem with this person's ability to express himself. Was this a token of love? Zhang Yingying's thoughts were flying, and Luonan's thoughts were quite jumpy as well. He replied in an incongruous manner, "Our hobbies are a bit similar." Only those who were familiar with Luonan could tell that he was referring to sketches and relief sculptures. They were both part of the plastic arts. The other side was certainly stupefied. Zhang Yingying covered her face with her hands. She felt that if these two were to continue talking, a great battle would certainly break out. But looking at it from another angle, it seemed that Luonan's mood was a lot more relaxed than before. Sure enough, after venting in a perverted manner, there would be positive emotional feedback? Reality seemed to verify Zhang Yingying's conjecture. Following Luonan's off-key response, the height of the waves instantly surged to the side of the yacht by 3 to 5 meters. It felt as if the waterfall wall above them was going to be thrown over and crush the yacht. As for the telepathic thought that was already sufficiently tyrannical, it became even more restless. It was to the point that Zhang Yingying needed to rein in her mind and do her utmost to avoid contact in order to avoid suffering from the backlash. "Hey, do you really want to shed all pretense of cordiality?" Luonan wasn't anxious at all. "Right now your fulcrums are becoming fewer and fewer. It's not too convenient to project power from a long distance, right? 1, 2, both are fine. Yes. I believe that even if there are only 1 or 2 fulcrums left, it's still enough for you to toss and turn about like a tsunami. And you absolutely have the ability to protect 1 or 2 fulcrums. But if you do this, you'll expose too many traces and clues. You're the one who's exposed. Oh, I admit it. You found that thing inside the mist, and you even injured it. You cut it in half. You're ruthless enough. But I've decided to forgive you. This is because, thanks to you, I just discovered that its importance isn't as important as I thought it was. The expression of Luo Nan's fake body was rich. Well, Zhang Yingying couldn't see it, but the movements of his body were extremely natural. Even though she clearly knew that it was fake, she couldn't find any unreal feeling from watching it collapse. On the contrary, Zhang Yingying, who was familiar with Luo Nan, could hear the overly exaggerated flavor of Luo Nan's tone of conversation. It was a bit like he was imitating a big shot from a movie. The current Luo Nan could basically beat all the powerful characters in movies and television works. Zhang Yingying's gaze swept over the surrounding sea, and her eyelids twitched a few times. Yes, the murder cases under his hands were enough. After some careful thought, it was quite a good match. Luo Nan didn't know that Zhang Yingying was giving him the title of Big Boss Butcher behind his back. Right now he was quite used to this attitude. He extended a hand, and his finger drew a few lines in the air that had unknown meanings. The lines faced the waterfall wall not too far away. Buddy, you've already used too much strength. The transmission trajectory is very clear. It's true that it's quite far, but do you want to make a bet? Let's have another long-range battle. It doesn't matter who wins or loses. I'll personally pay a visit to the third round of attacks. Bang! A muffled explosion of air exploded from Luo Nan's fingertip. The lines he had drawn just now had exploded once more. This time there was an improvement. His finger was saved. Luo Nan laughed. He finally stopped teasing Niu Gui. This time he grasped the main point. He pointed at the struggling and howling Niu Gui by his feet. Aren't you just interested in this fellow? It just so happens that I'm quite interested as well. We've already researched this before. Your eyes are wide open, but why do I feel that your analytical abilities aren't quite good enough? If you really could do it, then you wouldn't have followed him all the way here, and it would have been my turn to do it. I can do it much better than you. Luo Nan extended his hand and brushed past Niu Gui's body as he spoke. There was an illusory thicket glowing with a dim light. He didn't know why, but the brightness over there had clearly exploded by a level. I feel that we can be a bit more honest. Actually, I'm not one to keep things to myself. If I can share something, I definitely won't be stingy. Everyone, please cooperate. I'll cooperate. I'll cooperate. An indistinct yet resounding scream exploded next to Luo Nan's feet. Luo Nan, who had the demeanor of a big boss, nearly gave it a kick. Zhang Yingying's cry of surprise represented the feelings of practically everyone present. Holy crap! It can talk. Chapter 1005. The one who spoke human words and took the initiative to surrender was none other than the flesh-skinned Niu Gui. He had already been forcefully wrapped in the membrane of flesh and blood, and he had squeezed out the belief system crystal from his stomach. Right now, his 8 limbs were about to be severed once more. It seemed that he was more worried about his legs that were about to be severed. Zhang Yingying's curiosity was about to explode. The hovering camera immediately rushed over and fiercely took pictures. She wanted to let Niu Gui speak a few more words, but she didn't know if the fellow's brain was damaged from fear or something. He only said the 3 words, "I'll cooperate," over and over again. The rest of his words reverted back to a muffled howl. He can't just say these 3 words, right? Zhang Yingying's train of thought took off once more. Then what kind of life did he lead before? Luo Nan's communication with the coward was interrupted by Niu Gui's sudden voice. However, the attention of the 2 sides in the communication was naturally focused on this target, which could be considered the core of the problem. Luo Nan's actions were fine, but the evil eye that was faintly discernible within the flow of water on top of the waterfall wall several dozen meters away flourished with radiance in this instant. The radiance shone directly over, reflecting the intense intentions of Niu Gui. It's useless. I couldn't even deal with the parasite when it moved to the side, let alone now. Of course, this is a good change. Being able to communicate means that I can absorb information more comprehensively and make judgments. Luonan's hand cut through the tree of nothingness above Nyogue once more. It was like a magician's work. This time, the dense fluorescence of the tree of nothingness dimmed once more. Its state of light seemed to be completely under Luonan's control. In this darkest state, an even more substantial chain of light shot out from Luonan's fingertip. It was like the most dazzling of lightning. It pierced through the branches of the thicket, then vanished without a trace. It was dazzling yet brief. Zhang Yingying watched Luonan perform his magic. She was about to see an illusion. She felt that the disappearance of the lightning did not seem to be extinguished. Instead, it seemed to have penetrated the barrier of the void and penetrated all the way from the treetop area to the root area hidden behind the void and penetrated even deeper. If this was a hallucination, then it was certainly Meng Chang's fault. The source was Luonan. The description of the plant type was bizarre and garrulous. It made one's imagination run wild. However, in the next moment, the bull ghost, who was still howling, suddenly felt his throat choking. He couldn't even spit out a complete syllable. Soon, his breathing became difficult, and his already huge bull eyes almost popped out of their socket. Zhang Yingying thought that Luonan was going to make a move on Nyogue because the membrane of flesh and blood was strangling him. But when she looked at it again, she realized that this wasn't the case. This thought was completely unreasonable. This time she was completely confused. Fortunately, Luonan withdrew his hand after a mere second. This allowed Nyogue to catch his breath, and Luonan gave a simple explanation. After a deep segmentation of the system, the symptoms of rejection are quite obvious. The upper and lower pathways are not smooth. There are problems with its information-carrying capacity and adaptive ability. It doesn't seem like it often interacts with its believers. But it's very strange that it was able to cultivate to this extent. There's some room for research here, but it seems like you can't do it. Luonan was referring to the coward, but Zhang Yingying's heart felt stifled. She rolled her eyes and simply adjusted herself to the level of a brainless spectator to avoid being caught in the crossfire. The coward didn't immediately respond. The glow of the evil eye on the wall of waterfall above the sea dimmed. It looked like the most unfortunate one was still the bull ghost. His declaration of surrender was completely useless. Instead, his body, which had already been forcefully wrapped and shrunk, looked like it had been stripped of water. It became much more shriveled. For a time, he couldn't even scream. He just lay on the deck and gasped for breath. The yacht was still moving at high speed, and the wall of waterfall on the sea followed them the entire way. However, the communication between them was suddenly cut off. Was it probably weighing the pros and cons? Reality didn't give the other side too much time to think. A wave of rumbling thunder suddenly crushed down from the sky above the clouds that had been forcefully severed. This wasn't the sound of thunder, but the sound of a supersonic fighter flying past. However, what attracted the attention of the people here was the tyrannical and exuberant blood energy over there. Could it be that the extraordinaries from D-City had arrived? They were really fast. Zhang Yingying subconsciously turned her head to look at Her Majesty Empress Wu. The latter shook her head and pulled her arm out from Zhang Yingying's embrace. She turned around and left. Hey, boss. Her Majesty Empress Wu didn't respond, but her meaning was very clear. There were already 4 powerful extraordinaries in this area. What was the point of continuing to confront each other? There was no need to say anything. They definitely wouldn't be able to fight. Sure enough, the tyrannical intent of the coward that stretched across the surrounding sea began to subside. Correspondingly, the clouds in the sky clearly became a lot livelier. They began to gradually fill in the gaps in the center. However, what needed to be expressed had to be expressed. Words that needed to be said certainly wouldn't be missed. I'll keep an eye on you. Tell me that we're friends. Perhaps we'll drink a toast to our friendship very soon. It really wasn't easy. Big Brother Luo had established his persona. There was no more response from the other side. Only the evil eye on the waterfall wall was completely extinguished. Then the needed seawater scattered, striking the surface of the sea with a rumble. Luonan let out a breath. Before he could jump out of his persona, a fighter jet painted in matte gray pierced out from the depths of the clouds. It was less than 100 meters away from the surface of the sea. It whistled past the yacht diagonally. In the end, it even flapped its wings. Only the heavens knew what it meant. The fighter jet revealed itself for a moment. Then it flew into the depths of the ocean without looking back. Looking at its direction, it seemed to be going the same way as the yacht. "Who's this?" Big Brother Luo instantly turned into a curious baby. He turned his head to look for Zhang Yingying for an answer. Zhang Yingying could only shrug in response. It must be said that the yacht's speed was quite fast. After a few twists and turns, the yacht had completely left the most desperate part of the sea. That was if the membrane of flesh and blood that still wrapped around half of the hull of the yacht was discounted. The situation eased up, and her thoughts inevitably entered a complicated state. Zhang Yingying thought about the origin of this membrane and connected it with the controller. Her entire person felt bad. Seeing that Luonan had the intention to come over and talk, she simply waved out her baihong. "Clean it up for me before you come up. My yacht, you bastard!" The violent winds and huge waves began to subside. The gathered marine life forms were practically wiped out. The membrane of flesh and blood completely retreated back into the sea. The lower deck of the yacht became as clean as if a dog had licked it clean. At least that was what it looked like on the surface. Zhang Yingying's mind was strong. She took this as the truth for the time being. She stepped onto the deck and didn't feel anything. But when she got closer to Luonan, she couldn't help but reach out and pinch the young face that still had a bit of childishness to it. She sized him up carefully. "How come I never saw that you had such a perverted trait before?" "Don't mention the matter of an operational error." Luonan directly turned his face incorporeal, breaking away from Zhang Yingying's grip. But this sort of method was tantamount to hammering another nail into his perverted template. Zhang Yingying wanted to roll her eyes again. The number of sanitary balls she released today could probably prevent cockroaches from growing on the yacht for the next 10 years. "Moo moo moo. It's alive." The Nyo-Gue on the deck broke free of the membrane of flesh and blood at this time. The pain from the deformation of its body eased, and it was finally able to return to its original position. It lay on the deck with its 8 legs propped up and its chest and abdomen stuck to the ground. This made it feel as if it had been reborn. It let out a loud cry of praise. Luonan, Zhang Yingying, and Meng Chong all shifted their gazes over to focus fire on its deformed body. In an instant, the Nyo-Gue's body was forced down by at least half a meter. It was practically stuck flat to the deck. Only the Nyo-Gue's head was slightly raised. It squeezed out a smile that was extremely recognizable to humans. Rather than calling it a Nyo-Gue, it was more like a flattering dog. It looked absolutely willing to let it lie on the deck and lick the food. Zhang Yingying couldn't help but grumble. "The secret orders should all be crying, right?" Meng Chong. Luonan's gaze was actually on the tree of nothingness floating around the Nyo-Gue's body. The Nyo-Gue was quite intelligent. At the very least, it understood the principle of having a lover's wealth arousing suspicion. It simply flashed the most valuable thing on its body, allowing Luonan to do as he pleased. "What do you think?" Zhang Yingying asked for Luonan's opinion on how to deal with it. Luonan grunted, but he didn't immediately respond. But the more Luonan acted like this, the more the Nyo-Gue, who was lying on the deck, began to tremble. Its previous attitude of loud praise had completely disappeared. Only its 8 limbs remained, and the lower ends of its limbs struck the deck amidst trembling. They clattered as if they would fall apart at any moment. Meng Chong simply turned his head to look at the sky. Zhang Yingying blinked her eyes. She cooperatively changed the topic. "The boss just sent word. Blood Demon wants to see you." "Blood Demon?" Luonan finally remembered the name of this extraordinaire. Not too long ago, their group of people had been discussing the inexplicable operation of this extraordinaire's purchase of Cards magazine. Soon, he came to a realization. The one who flew over just now was him, right? Yeah, that's right. He wants to discuss a business deal with you. He said that he has a card that you'll definitely be interested in. Right now, he's going to Koro Base first. The boss agreed on your behalf. He said that this guy is an expert gambler, and you don't lack luck. This is also a part of diplomacy. Smart. Actually, Luonan wanted to ask Her Majesty Empress Wu who the coward was. Though he already had some guesses, wouldn't it be better to just look at the standard answer? Oh right. The boss said a long time ago that this fellow is your spoils of war. How to deal with him is up to you. Luonan casually said, Can I just throw him off the ship? Let him convey some goodwill to Brother Coward? Do as you wish. Ah moo moo moo. Nyogue immediately howled. His trembling sharp limbs nearly pierced through the deck. Then he frantically displayed his talent for language. Keep me! Keep me! I'm valuable! I have a card! Luonan laughed. Just based on the card you used to run away with the money? Nyogue was stunned. Big Boss Luo took advantage of the situation to come online. Lord Dark Dragon God, everyone in the Great Swamp Order will probably perform a mass disembowelment if they see you like this, right? Or maybe I can use you to negotiate a price with Matsudaira Yoshio? Don't. Please don't. A muffled boom rang out. This time, the lower deck was really pierced through. Nyogue didn't care about Zhang Yingying's furious glare. He raised his bull head and continued to ram it, wailing and begging for mercy. Matsudaira Yoshio died a long time ago. Right now, there's a demon over there. A demon?